In March of 1996, I was taken to a psychiatric hospital and restrained to a bed, a little bit like this guy. My family was devastated when the psychiatrist said that I could have bipolar disorder or even schizophrenia. But I wasn't worried. What seemed insanity to everyone around me, to me seemed more like a spiritual awakening, the most sacred and special experience of my entire life. But what I didn't know until I studied the work of visionary psychiatrists like Dr. Carl Jung, Dr. Lauren Mosher, Dr. John Weir Perry, and especially Dr. Stan Grof, was that many people diagnosed bipolar also have very powerful spiritual experiences very similar to my own, and that these experiences all start with a collapse of the ego. And while not always, usually this ego collapse is caused by a period of radical change in a person's life. Now, what exactly is an ego? Well, that's not such an easy thing to explain because in our society we say like, oh, this guy's got a big ego, and we talk about it like that. But that's not really it. The ego is our false self. It's who we think we are, but we're not. And the best analogy I can come up with is to imagine that you're a baby chick and that you're inside the egg. But you also think that you're the eggshell. The eggshell is you, and in that sense, that's what our ego is. Our ego is the shell around us that we use to protect ourselves, but at the same time it limits us. It limits our full potential. So eventually we need to break out of that ego, or shell, in order to grow. So just to give you an example of what an ego is like an egg. And here we have Bill Shatner's false self, his egg, his ego. And a big part of Bill Shatner's ego is that he's 19 years old and he considers himself his dad's son. Bill and his father have a great relationship, he respects him a lot, and that's a big part of who he thinks he is. I am my dad's son. He's also Sue's boyfriend. Sue is his longtime girlfriend, they've been dating for a couple of years, and he's proud of that relationship as well. Another relationship that's very close to him is his relationship with his city, New York. He considers himself a true New Yorker, he's a Yankees fan, and he really wouldn't live anywhere else if you asked him at this point in his life. And being a true New Yorker, for him life is all about success. If you're not a winner, then you're a loser, and get out of the way. And so Bill is very competitive, and as part of that competitive nature, he considers himself to be a very good student. He studies very hard, takes his studies very seriously, and as part of being a good student, he's working hard to get into a good university. He's also a Christian. His family is Christian, and he was raised reading the Bible. He goes to church on Sundays, and the values and the beliefs of Christianity are very close to him. So all of these different aspects of Bill's life, his religion, his relationships, his attitudes towards life, his desire to get into a good university, his city, all of these things compose who he thinks he really is on a subconscious level, and they all represent parts of his ego that he shows the world, in a sense his false self. And because he works very hard to maintain this image of himself, he has a lot of worries like, what if I don't get into a good university? Or what if I lose the people that are close to me? These sorts of things. The ego causes a lot of fear. But then something happens. His father dies, and that is a very traumatic experience for him. He really doesn't know what to do with himself, and he suffers greatly with this death. He suffers so much that when it comes time to study for his exams, he really doesn't study very much, and he fails his exams. But to his surprise, he finds that in failing, he really doesn't care that much that he failed, and he really didn't care about university the way he used to. Maybe university was something that his father wanted for him more than he did. But along with that, what happens to him as the great student? He starts to wonder, well, am I a failure? What's wrong with me? I don't want to do this anymore. I don't know why I'm pushing myself so hard. And so with his father's death, he starts to question a lot of things in his life, and as part of this questioning, he finds himself going deeper and deeper into a depression. And it's at this point that his girlfriend Sue leaves him because she just can't stand to be around a guy who's depressed all the time. And with that breakup, he really starts to question his values now. And he starts to think to himself, you know what? Ever since my dad died, I want a simpler life. Life is not about success and hard charging for me. Life is about simplicity. That's what I want my life to be about. And with that shift in values, he starts to look in different directions. And one of the directions he looks is Arizona. He decides to enroll at the University of Arizona, where he chooses to start a whole new life. But once out there, what happens to his Christianity? Well, it kind of goes up in the air because he meets all of these New Age people with completely different beliefs than what he was raised with, and they've just got this other way of looking at the world. It's very mystical. They do a lot of tarot card reading and massage, and he really doesn't believe in all that stuff, but he doesn't really know what to believe of his Christianity anymore either. And so with that, he starts to feel a little bit strange, a little lost. So many changes have happened to him so fast, and so much of his old identity, of who he thought he was, has just disappeared overnight. It all leaves him feeling like his feet are not quite touching the ground. Then, in the middle of all this change, Bill might find himself at a party, and he's had a few drinks, maybe a little marijuana, and then boom, a total ego collapse. Everything he thought about himself seems to have disappeared. He doesn't know who he is anymore. All he knows is he's got this huge surge of energy pulsating through his body, and this energy is literally taking him on a journey. He's going to a place that he's never visited. He's taking a journey into his very own soul. You literally feel your soul awakening and all of your senses coming up so strongly in this manic process that you don't really know what to do with yourself, and you're really confused. You start to ask yourself questions. What is reality? What's real? Am I going crazy? Am I dead? Am I dreaming? I don't know. Who am I becomes a very important question once you're capable of even asking yourself the question, because let me tell you, it's a mad and mystic journey, but when possible, it should not be suppressed. Now, it's important to point out that for some people, these experiences may be very scary, and they may in fact be better off taking medications to stop the experience. However, for many others, what we know today as an acute psychosis has the potential of being a tremendously healing spiritual experience, something which can truly transform a person's life for the better. The trouble is, with the way our society aggressively handles people in these experiences, the opportunity for healing rarely happens. You see, even in the most ideal situations, there will be parts of the experience that are very difficult, even painful to go through, and to make it through, most people are going to need very compassionate support. But unfortunately, this type of support is rarely given because as a society we have very little understanding of these experiences, and as a result we're very fearful of them. And that's why it's the mission of my YouTube channel, Bipolar or Waking Up, to let people know that once you deeply understand the nature of these otherworldly experiences, you'll see that in truth they are far from the meaningless madness which our society says they are. In fact, if your manic episode was anything like Bill's or my own, it might just turn out to be the most important experience of your life. Now, what can trigger an ego collapse? Well, it could be almost anything, but for most people, like Bill, it's the combination of a series of powerful life events and changes that cause the first experience of the collapse of the ego. Bipolar enlightenment. Bipolar enlightenment. Could it be that these two experiences, which seem so different from each other, could actually be on a sensory level the same thing? At first you may think this is impossible, but when you take a closer look, both experiences start with the same event, a collapse of the ego. Now, most people already know that bipolar disorder can have some pretty negative symptoms, like spending lots of money, having big mood swings, or even hallucinations and paranoia, which I talk about at length in other videos. But few people are aware that a bipolar manic episode can also include many symptoms that have been associated throughout history with glimpses of spiritual enlightenment. So, whether you're a Buddhist monk who gets there by meditating for 20 years, or you're a 19-year-old kid who gets hit by it in a shopping mall, both experiences will most likely involve aspects which are deeply spiritual in nature. And when I say spiritual, what I really mean is mystical. So now I'm going to take you through a series of sensory experiences which are common to both the person going through an experience of enlightenment and the person going through the type of acute psychosis which is commonly associated with bipolar 1. And to illustrate my point, I'll be using the work of my favorite artist, Salvador Dali, who I'm sure you would agree, if he were alive today, would be heavily medicated. The first thing that often happens in a bipolar manic crisis, and is also known to happen in different forms of enlightenment, such as a Kundalini awakening, is that you have this incredible surge of high energy. That's usually the first thing that hits you. As I described in detail in the first video of this series, the cause of this surge in energy is that there's an ego collapse and the soul is set free for the first time. Speaking personally, the deepest mystic experience that I had was the sense of oneness with everything. You lose the feeling of separation between your body and everything else, so that you feel that you are everything and everything is you. You feel as if you've accessed a deeper level of reality, and with that there is a deeper level of understanding regarding who we are and what we're doing here on earth. The experience is indescribable in terms of communicating in normal language, and as a result, the person in the experience may try and express themselves by using metaphors. A person's senses may also be heightened with improved vision, taste, smell, and hearing. They also have a heightened sensitivity towards other people. You can feel other people's vibe or read their thoughts in a way that you never could before. For many people, there's a sense of timelessness, with some people having the sensation that they can control time, stopping or starting time based on their own individual desire or concentration. There will often be an overwhelming sense of love coming out of you, with an affection for other people and an appreciation for beauty, so that you may find yourself having expressions of love for even plants or animals. There is a release of many repressions in these experiences, and one of the biggest is the release of the shame we have of our own bodies. This is why it's so common for people to strip naked during psychosis. And with all of this happening, there's just an overwhelming feeling of sacredness to everything, as if you're in the most magnificent church or temple in the world. Everything around you seems to be touched by God. As Dr. John Weir Perry describes in the book The Far Side of Madness, you may feel that you're in a type of middle world, not quite heaven, not quite earth, a sort of purgatory or bardo in which all of these experiences are happening. And very often in this middle world, you'll feel that you're being tested by God in some way, and that maybe even people are coming to you not as they appear, as in their earthly name, but as some sort of characters that are there to test you. And a big part of this test will involve a confrontation with death. Most people feel that they are somehow encountering their own death or think that they have died in this process. As part of the healing which takes place, there is often a regression into the origins of your own life. Many people find themselves returning to their early childhood or even into the womb of their mother. Others have the sensation of returning to the beginning of the cosmos, the Big Bang in a sense. And for some, it's a combination of both, as well as other powerful experiences, such as recalling a past life. And as your process starts to move through, you begin to have a shift in your values. Your own feelings and sense of personal integrity become more important to you than they ever were before. There's also a broadening of your consciousness, an elevation to a more social, global consciousness, so that global issues such as the environment or poverty, which maybe were in the back of your mind before, now are right in front of you as a pressing issue. So, like I was saying in the beginning, if you're a 19-year-old kid who's been hit by a bipolar manic crisis, you should easily be able to recognize some, if not all, of these sensory experiences that I'm talking about. But what you didn't know is that throughout history, all of these sensory experiences that you have somehow been related to different forms of enlightenment. These mystical sensory experiences have been associated with Satori in Zen, Samadhi in Hinduism, Nirvana from Buddhism, and even the visions which Christian saints would have. And in the West, these experiences have been recognized by a number of psychologists and psychiatrists as well, leading-edge people such as Dr. Stan Grof, who refer to these experiences as being part of a spiritual emergency. Ken Wilber refers to a variety of mystic experiences, and I think all of these would be related to what he calls nature mysticism. And Abraham Maslow, who is most famous for the Maslow hierarchy of needs, referred to what I describe here as part of a peak experience. So there's clearly a history of understanding these experiences on a psychological level in the West. However, what is enlightenment or a mystic experience in the mainstream today? Well, according to science, psychiatry, and our supposedly modern society, Enlightenment is insanity. It's a bipolar manic crisis, an acute psychosis. It doesn't exist. It's a complete breakdown of our rational thought caused by brain damage or a chemical imbalance. It has no value to your life whatsoever, and it's to be stopped with medications at all costs. Now what I want to do in part 2 of this video is show you some examples of how each of these spiritual experiences can lead to some very strange behavior on your part, behavior which everyone around you will mistakenly see as signs of mental illness. So that's up next. Okay, so now let's go back and review the sensory experience which you have after your ego collapses and see how this plays out in your behavior, which everyone around you will take for symptoms that you've lost your mind. Well, to start with this incredible surge of energy that you have, you can't sleep, you can't stop moving, and you can't stop talking. Now, to help you move through this period of high energy, the best thing to do is to find a way to express it through art, writing, or even dance or exercise. Basically, anything you can do to work the energies through that you're dealing with. With that sense of oneness I was talking about, everything might seem like a dream and you'll want to test reality. You might want to try and walk through a wall or go out and stand in traffic or even fly out a window, and that of course can be very dangerous for you. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be strapped to a hospital bed against your will, but anyone in a state of acute psychosis should have 2 people with them to offer protection and emotional support at all times. Because you'll have this deeper understanding, you'll want to share your ideas with people, but most of the time they won't be ready to listen to what you have to say. It could be because what you are saying is confusing to them, or perhaps your new ideas are disturbing to them because they're so different from their way of seeing things. And like I said in the previous video, the experience is so indescribable that you may use metaphors to try and explain what's happening to you, like, I'm in heaven, or I am God. And while you may be speaking symbolically or poetically, the people around you could take you literally, thinking, he thinks he's in heaven, he thinks he's God, he's totally crazy. And that's why it's very important that any support people that you do have working with you need to be very open-minded and very non-judgmental about what's happening to you. Now, it is true that some people get stuck in delusions which they themselves take very literally, such as thinking that they're Jesus the Messiah. However, if someone is healing and working through their process, these strongly held delusions should loosen their grip within a few weeks, perhaps even a few days. And with the enhanced sensory experience, you may respond very strongly to smells or noises, or be very entranced by certain visual patterns, leading to more strange behavior. Speaking personally, it was my own fascination with the heightened sensory world that I was in, which led me into thinking that I was dead. Another place where this heightened sensitivity can cause you problems is at the psychiatric hospital, because being in such a cold and hostile environment, people tend to act terribly in front of their psychiatrist, giving them more proof that you need medications. But the truth is, you may just be reacting to your surroundings and how you're being treated. Because you enter a world of timelessness, you may have no idea how long you've been in the hospital or how long you've been in a certain situation. What day is it? What year is it? And of course, the people around you will find this very disturbing. Perhaps one of the most positive aspects of the bipolar manic crisis is the overwhelming sense of love that you can feel inside of yourself, and your willingness to express this love with perhaps even perfect strangers who are just sending you a positive energy. You may want to put your arms around them, hug them, or perhaps even get sexual with them. And even with this somewhat positive experience, it may be looked on with fear from others because it's so different and is not normal. I think one of the key characteristics of bipolar mania is your loss of shame, and when that comes, you immediately want to take off your clothes almost in protest. It's like you look down and you think, what are these clothes doing on me? And you need to get naked, and very often you may want to even piss or shit, basically anywhere that you are. And even masturbation isn't out of the question because it goes along with this total release of repressions. That sense of sacredness I talked about can lead you into revering or bowing to people as you truly identify with the God side of them. You may see people who are close to you that are giving you love as some sort of saint or angel, and you'll treat them accordingly. And don't forget, being in a sort of middle world, people often tend to get quite delusional. They start to make up stories about what's really happening to them. And in that story, they may think of themselves as some sort of historical character like Jesus or perhaps a king. And as you come to them, they'll see you as a different character as well. And as you're being tested by God, you will often be very disobedient with worldly authority. You'll resist arrest, you might fight people who are trying to control you, and you will literally think that this is a matter of life and death for you. And in fact, it may be, because even though it is an apparent delusion, it has tremendous symbolic meaning for you as a person going through it. Think about it. How you're able to work through this very difficult spiritual experience is going to have a direct impact on how you live the rest of your life. As part of the confrontation with death that I mentioned, you may think that you need to kill yourself in a way in order to move on to the next level, to the spirit world, and leave this material world behind. This can lead to a form of a ritualized suicide. Now, this suicide isn't so much an attempt to end your life as it is to continue your life on the spirit level, and so it can be very symbolic. For example, in my situation, a suicide was simply turning out the lights in a ballroom I was in. The imagery of regressions can come in many forms. Personally, I remember revisiting parts of my childhood, then going back into experiences of the cosmos. At one point in the hospital, I was making ape noises as I was visualizing scenes from the movie A 2001 Space Odyssey. Like I was going back to the beginning of time, and that movie was the representation of that return. And believe me, when you start making ape noises in front of the psychiatrist, you're in for a long stay. And finally, with your shift in values, expanded awareness, and increasing concern for social issues, you might see yourself getting very emotional about issues that never seemed to bother you before. Disturbing images that you see on TV, or even buried problems within your own family may get you very upset, whereas before you would just put up with it. In fact, bringing up family issues or family secrets is such a central part of the healing of acute psychosis that I've dedicated one video to this subject alone. So despite the fact that many of the experiences or emotional shifts which you are going through are quite positive, your behavior will be strange, and almost everything you do will be interpreted negatively by almost everyone around you. Now, I don't want to overgeneralize by making this sound like one big party that was ruined by your parents and doctors, because once your healing process begins, there will be a lot of fear and pain that you'll need to open up to as well. And from what I've seen, I believe that a big part of the fear is simply connected to the newness of the whole experience. So that even for people who have quite positive manic experiences, once they snap back into reality, they might find the transition very frightening because they don't know what just happened to them. Another source of fear or pain will be related to the trauma or even negative energies that you may have carried around for your entire life. It was Dr. Carl Jung who first identified this somewhat scary part of ourselves, calling it the shadow, over 80 years ago. And when our shadow starts to come out, we can start to act pretty nasty. One minute we may be saying to someone that we love them, and then maybe 20 minutes later we're looking at them saying, "I hate you, get out of my face." And so with all of these spiritual aspects happening, being in a middle world, having strong experiences of love as well as fear, you may even start to question your own sanity in the middle of this, and at the very least you will be very confused about what's happening to you. But what's important to remember is that all of this is part of a very complex spiritual healing process, which, if at all possible, needs to be supported and not blocked. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that yes, when a person goes into the acute psychosis often associated with bipolar mania, they do exhibit very strange behavior, there's no doubt about it. But there are reasons for this. There is a sensory experience that the person is undergoing beneath the surface of things that up to now modern psychiatry has simply dismissed as signs of mental illness. And I think that if more people in a bipolar manic crisis are going to heal, that the support network we have of doctors, families, and friends needs to come at this with more love and less fear. They need to support this person, and they need to understand that this is basically a healing spiritual event that needs to happen for their long-term benefit. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that after you pass through an experience like this without medication, that you'll reach ultimate enlightenment and all of your problems will go away, because that's not going to happen. But the more you understand how to work through these processes, the better off you'll be. Starting in April 2007, I began an investigation into the difference between the beneficial psychotic episode that I had 12 years ago, which I came to understand as a spiritual emergency, and this thing called bipolar disorder, or more specifically bipolar mania, which some people in my family had been diagnosed with a year ago. As many of you know, during this year of research, I've made many YouTube videos, and through YouTube, I've been in close contact with over 150 bipolar people who have been gracious enough to share their stories with me. I've received thousands of YouTube comments that I've also learned from. I've read about 15 new books in that time and looked at hundreds of websites and videos, both for psychiatry and against psychiatry. And together with my wife, we've worked with 4 people this year through 6 manic episodes of acute psychosis, basically periods of insanity like I went through 12 years earlier. And the big thing I've learned this year is that while there's no guarantees, bipolar disorder and schizophrenia can be healed. And if you don't believe me, I highly suggest that you take a look at the work of some pioneering psychiatrists from the 1970s who were healing schizophrenics in a way completely different than the typical hospitalization environment that we all know today. The late Dr. John Weir Perry documents very high levels of success rates with schizophrenics at his clinic Diabasis in his book Trials of a Visionary Mind. Dr. Loren Mosher also set up a similar project called Soteria in San Francisco while he was the chief of the Schizophrenia Center at the National Institute of Mental Health. The book Soteria is a great look at what happened in that house for over a 12-year period. And I also have a film of Soteria in my YouTube favorites that's very interesting for you to take a look at. Dr. Stan Grof has made a career of healing people from various mental illnesses, many of the stories of which he shares in his new book, When the Impossible Happens, which really challenges mainstream psychiatry. Perhaps the most interesting story is of Dr. David Lukoff, who in 1972 thought he was Buddha and Christ and was here on a messianic journey to save the world. Dr. David Lukoff is the one that fought to get the term spiritual emergency recognized in the DSM-IV. Now here's the shocker. The reason that these doctors can heal people in acute psychosis like bipolar mania, schizophrenia, spiritual emergencies is that they recognize that acute psychosis in itself is intended to be a healing process. It's not a mental illness at all. It is a healing process. You see, what happens in an acute psychosis is not that you've lost your mind, but rather that you've been plunged into the subconscious of your mind. Now, the problem with our society today, be it the doctors or our parents, is that we don't give value to this experience, and in fact, we think that the non-ordinary states of consciousness that you go into during a psychotic period have no value whatsoever. In fact, we're terrified of them as a society. And as a result, we don't want you to go there. You are not allowed to have this experience. So what happens is the doctors and the family, they form a rescue mission to get you out of that water. And as we all know, part of that rescue mission now means hospitalizing you, medicating you, telling you that you're mentally ill and that you have a permanent condition like asthma or diabetes that you will need medication for your entire life. And unfortunately, as things are today, this is what's happening, because once they tell you these things and they get you medicated and hospitalized in this way and tell you that this experience is to be feared and avoided, well, it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy and you never heal properly the way you're supposed to. And that's why bipolar people, as soon as they go off their medications, it doesn't take them very long usually before they go into a relapse, because this is a healing process, much like if you were vomiting. You've got some sickness inside of you and it needs to come out. And as soon as those medications stop, the vomiting starts again. It's a healing process. You're supposed to go into psychosis. And once you're there, once you're in that non-ordinary state of consciousness, instead of fighting against this process, what you really need to do is surrender and just let go. And during this acute psychosis, what I've especially learned working with people this year is that unlike my own situation where I was able to fight off negative forces and sort of respect my experience, most people, bipolar people, especially if you're younger, are absolutely going to need support and help to get through this process. And where people especially need the help and support isn't so much when they're in that sort of high state where everything's sort of dreamy and sparkly and wonderful, but during periods where trauma is released. Because the secret to this acute psychosis is it is releasing you from trauma that you've held in your body for your entire life. And the trauma that is released can come in a variety of forms. In my case, I had a scuba diving accident a few months before my manic episode, and that experience really came back to me and started my episode. So physical problems and physical accidents can be part of the trauma that's released. The most common one to psychology is like things like the relationship you have with your parents. And I would say almost everybody I talked to, maybe everybody, had an issue with one of their parents, where the parent tends to be a kind of a hard person that insists that the child live according to their rules and according to their ways. Most of the bipolar people I know have had an issue with a particular hard parent. And in the case of, especially with schizophrenia, this parenting trouble can be deeper. It can be related to physical abuse, and for many schizophrenics, sexual abuse is a huge part of the trauma they're dealing with in their daily life. And we're just covering it up and covering it over by telling them that they've got a chemical imbalance. So instead of dealing with bipolar mania like this, we've got to start dealing with it more like this. And I intentionally picked out this picture because it shows a compassionate love between two men, which would normally be taken as a homosexual relationship. But I'm telling you that when you're dealing with a person in acute psychosis, you've got to be available to give them unconditional love regardless of their sex. You've got to be able to bond with them on a very intimate level. And the reason is that when people are in a manic state, they are so much more sensitive than you could ever imagine. And as soon as you're in front of them, they can tell whether you are coming to them with love or you're coming to them with fear. And as it's dealt with now, everybody is coming at them with fear. So again, these people need to be approached with a loving intention. Their inner experience needs to be respected and validated as a sacred thing, a sacred healing process that they need to go through. And with your support, the person can now engage this inner process, and they really need that support because it can be scary for them. Like I said, it can really feel like a life and death situation. Now, typically, an acute psychosis is going to last maybe between 2 and 6 days. That's like when they're really out there and can be really insane, and they really require 2 people with them 24 hours a day during this period. And depending on the depth of the trauma that we're dealing with, it could take a few psychoses for this to actually finish. So in the example of my niece, she needed 3 manic episodes before she finally finished her process, and that took over a period of 2 months. So, is this process long and difficult? Sometimes, yes. It can be very difficult, especially to be a support person for these people. You need a lot of patience, you need a lot of compassion, and you need a lot of courage. However, even though this process can be very difficult for people for a few months, the benefit you get on the other end can be a total rebirth of this person. Not only do they go back to normal, but they come back healed. They go on to live a much more vital, much more alive life, and they can grow. And when you compare that to the long-term life of medication, thinking of yourself as mentally ill forever, I mean, there's just no comparison. So, in conclusion, obviously, this video is just the tip of the iceberg regarding what is a radically different approach to your bipolar disorder. And if you are bipolar out there, I highly recommend you subscribe, because for the rest of 2008, I'm going to be putting up one video after another that's going to help you look at your bipolar disorder in a whole new way. They call it bipolar disorder, a permanent mental illness caused by a chemical imbalance. But that's not what it feels like when you're bipolar. No, for most it feels a lot more like I can't be me disorder. Everyone else seems to be happy, going to school or work, having fun, being popular and successful. Why not you? Why can't you find your happiness? Maybe you do have a problem with your brain. Or do you? Maybe you're not broken at all. Maybe the world is simply not ready for someone like you, someone who feels life with an extra degree of intensity, someone who's probably had more than their share of pain at a fairly young age, someone who has a hard time dealing with how fake and phony the real world really is. But what is real? Well, as it turns out, our reality is not nearly as real as we thought it was. In fact, according to quantum physics, life itself is a lot more like the Matrix than most of us ever realized. However, unlike Neo, the prison that we're trapped in isn't run by evil machines. In our case, the walls of our prison are nothing but your own ego, and it's your ego which dictates your reality and your identity. In other words, the prison is in your mind. Now, what exactly is an ego is a big issue of debate, because you see, back just a few decades ago, Western psychologists were in the general agreement that the ego was who you are, and that the task of the psychologist was to help you develop your healthy ego so that you could function in this real, and by real I mean material, world. However, starting in the 1960s, some radical thinkers like Harvard psychologists Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert started looking at our ego in an older, mystical, spiritual way. Why? Because these doctors were having mystical experiences themselves, experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs. Says Timothy Leary, I learned more about my brain during the 5 hours I was on magic mushrooms than I had in the preceding 15 years of studying and researching psychology. Dr. Richard Alpert was so overwhelmed by his LSD experiences that eventually he went on a spiritual quest to India. Once there, he was given the name Ram Das by an enlightened guru, and upon returning from India became one of the great spiritual teachers of the 1970s. Now, speaking personally, I've never had any experience with hallucinogenic drugs, or any drugs for that matter, and I don't recommend them. However, it's also obvious that for Drs. Leary and Alpert, taking the hallucinogenics helped them to broaden their understanding of how our minds work. And the big insight that they had with regard to our minds was that the ego is not who we are, because under the influence of these drugs we lose our ego, and yet somehow we're still there. So unlike Freud had suggested, our ego is not who we are. Our ego is who we think we are, but we're not. It's our false self. And it is this false self which defines and limits not only our reality, but also our identity. Indeed, for all of us, our idea of what is real and what is possible is much more limited than any of us could have ever imagined, because our ego prevents us from seeing ourselves and our reality in any other way. So in other words, our egos are literally illusions that we live in which limit our reality. And with that said, the question becomes, well, if the ego is an illusion, why do we need it? Why is an ego important for us? A good analogy is to look at the world. Okay, here's the real world. But this isn't how we see the world. We see the world more like this, the map that has the countries on it. And all of these countries have boundaries. These boundaries are what separate me from you, Canada from the US, France from Germany, this sort of thing. And while the boundaries between these countries are illusions, in another way they are absolutely necessary, because if they came down today, our world would go into total chaos. And in the same way that the world would go into chaos without its borders, we go into a type of chaos without our egos. Without our ego there to limit us and protect us, we become like a kite without a string, flying high but totally ungrounded and in danger. In psychiatry today, they refer to this state as an acute psychosis, and it is in being in an acute psychosis that our true selves, or our souls, are set free on this material plane of reality. Now, the soul is an incredible thing. I mean, so connected to God that once you're in an acute psychosis of a manic episode, you may feel that you're God himself, or Jesus, or Buddha, or some other spiritual figure. In fact, without the ego there to protect it, the behavior of the soul is compelled towards being completely unrepressed. So, looked at from this perspective, rather than being a mental illness, we can start to see bipolar disorder as being an epic battle happening within the psyche, a battle between the soul, which wishes to be free, completely free to express itself in every way, and the ego, which is attempting to suppress any soulful expression or emotions which it deems to be dangerous to the survival of the body itself. And in this battle, when the soul overcomes the ego, we're in a state of mania or even acute psychosis. When the ego completely overcomes the soul, we go into a state of depression. And it's this unresolved conflict between the ego and the soul which is at the root of the cycling of bipolar disorder. As long as the conflict is there, we will move back and forth between mania and depression. And this battle will continue until it comes to a proper end, an end which medications bring about too quickly. Because what psychiatric medications do is they basically dull the chemistry of your body so that the ego can again take control of the situation, keeping the soul in check. And once that happens, you're considered sane again and you can function in daily reality.
But as we all know, without more drugs, people often slip from mania into depression because once the ego is in total control, the soul has little room to grow, to expand, and as a result, starts to feel dead. Once on antipsychotic medication, those limiting walls of reality seem even bigger and more imposing than they did before. Now, ironically, the so-called hallucinogenic drugs like LSD-25 or the organic magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, or even occasionally marijuana can have the opposite effect, but not as you might expect. I mean, these drugs were called hallucinogenics because it was assumed by doctors that it was the drugs themselves that were providing the hallucination experiences, the feelings of euphoria, etc. But that's really not what they do. What these drugs do is they cause a collapse, a temporary collapse of the ego functioning. And the hallucinations and delusions and the visions of angels and feelings of being God are all within you. They are experiences within yourself that are finally released now that the ego has collapsed. Now, for anyone who is bipolar, schizophrenic, or even completely normal, this battle between the true self of the soul and the false self of the ego should seem obvious. I mean, every day in our normal lives, there are things that we want to do, say, or experience that we don't, simply because we're afraid. And we do this because we learned at a young age that it's a lot easier to get along in life when you conform to other people's expectations of you than to be who you really are. And that may all be well and good when you're a little kid and you've got to learn how to behave yourself. But if you continue to live a life of total conformity, what you'll find yourself living is a life that's completely dead. You won't feel alive in your own life. And in this way, we are all repressed. We're all divided. Not only those people who are bipolar, but pretty much everybody else on the planet. My favorite guru Osho spent his whole life trying to heal this division within completely normal people. And this is what he had to say regarding normal life as it is today. In the past, we were unable to create real human beings. Instead, we made humanoids. A humanoid is one who looks like a human being, but is utterly challenged. He's divided because he is half. He is always tense, and he cannot celebrate. Others have been running his life for him. The parents, the teachers, the leaders, the priests. They've all taken away his decisiveness. They decide, they order. He simply follows. The humanoid is a slave. Only a fulfilled tree will flower, and man is yet to flower. The new man will be earthy and divine, worldly and otherworldly. He will live without any inner division, without getting split. He will transcend duality. He will not be schizophrenic. And with the new man will come a new world, because the new man will perceive in a qualitatively different way. Right now, the new man is bound to be a mutant minority, but he carries with him a new culture, a new seed. We now need a new humanity in which religion and science become two aspects of one human being, and art will be the bridge. That's why I say that the new man will be a mystic, a poet, and a scientist all together. He will be a mystic because he will feel the presence of God. He'll be a poet because he will celebrate that presence. And he will be a scientist because he will search into this presence through scientific methodology. And when man becomes all these three things together, man becomes whole. And to create the new man, you need to begin with yourself. So, looking at the world through Osho's eyes, I think it's pretty clear that the only disorder in bipolar disorder is the disorder of living the fake, everyday, normal life. So the next time you find yourself thinking, I can't be me, you might want to back up a bit and ask yourself, well, who are you? Because the reality that you're looking for is a lot closer than you think. And while the journey to get there may be difficult, it basically comes down to one thing: bringing the bipolar battle of the soul versus the ego to its proper end, where the soul is no longer repressed by the ego, but is served by the ego. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. In my last video, I talked about how, in order to heal bipolar disorder, the battle between the soul and the ego needed to come to its proper end.
And the first thing we need to do is provide supportive environments so that when people go into psychosis, we allow them to embrace and engage their experience instead of blocking it fearfully. And one of the things that happens when we allow the psychosis to process is that we go through a period of purification of the soul. And during this period, we have the opportunity to rid ourselves of much of the emotional pain that we carry with us in our daily lives. So in this video, I want to provide a type of inventory of all of the different experiences that can happen to you within psychosis that allow this soul purification to take place. Before I begin, I think it's interesting to mention that all the experiences I'm going to talk about can also happen during periods of meditation, during mystic states, and they can also be induced by taking psychedelic drugs. And the reason for that is that certain meditations, mystic practices, and drugs can lead to a collapse of the ego, which I've already explained in my video, The Real Cause of Bipolar Disorder. Very often, one of the first things to happen when people enter into a psychosis is that they have a release of their biological repressions. And with that, sexual repression is usually at the top of the list. Each one of us carries some level of sexual repression with us. If we didn't, we'd all be in jail. So with our inhibitions out of the way, we may find ourselves excessively sexual or flirtatious with people. We may be what is considered to be inappropriately affectionate with people, maybe people we don't even know. Or in deep psychosis, we may even start spontaneously masturbating. We may also recognize that at almost every moment of the day we're holding in our bladders or our intestines, and we may decide to just let all that go, pissing or shitting anytime, anywhere. Another thing that can happen, especially because your senses have come alive, is that we may have a particular fascination with these materials as well. Even in my own situation, I felt the need to pee on the carpet of a hotel ballroom and then lay right down in the urine afterwards. And probably one of the most common symptoms of manic episodes is our loss of shame. We just immediately feel the desire to get naked and do everything we can without our clothes on. Now, mania is a state that is famous for being quite high and sometimes extremely positive, and in other videos I've made, I've talked about the spiritual potential of these states, and in fact that they can be quite sacred experiences. But what happens usually is as the mania continues and you get through the oneness and connection to everything, what usually follows are regressions into experiences in your life which were emotionally painful for you, things that you probably still haven't gotten over yet, at least on an emotional level. And as a support person, being there next to somebody who is re-experiencing a trauma from their life can be very strange. Because while some people in psychosis may simply remember the experiences, others relive it. And so what will happen is when the person regresses into a painful trauma from their childhood, when you look at their face, you will see child's eyes and they may talk to you in the child's voice. And this occurs because the consciousness of the person is in another time and in another place. Now, it should be no surprise that many of these traumatic experiences revolve around physical abuse, verbal abuse, and sex abuse, especially among the most acute cases. And back in the 1960s, Dr. R.D. Laing was really the first psychiatrist to highlight the role of the dysfunctional family among people with mental disorders. In fact, one study I've come across recently showed that people suffering from schizophrenia were more than twice as likely to have divorced parents. So while trauma experienced in childhood plays a critical role in many mental disorders, trauma during adulthood can also play a role as well. And I'm not only talking about emotional issues, but physical accidents can also be a big part of the trauma which we need to heal. Death of a parent, child, or spouse is also enough to trigger a manic episode, especially among women. But in truth, the traumas which can heal during psychosis really come from any repressed memory or emotion that was too painful for us to deal with at the time that it happened. The fact that life traumas play a huge role in mental disorders should hardly be surprising. However, what will be surprising is that many people regress into the trauma they experienced at the time of their birth. In The Holotropic Mind, Stan Grof discusses in detail the different stages of our birth process and how the traumas from each stage of birth can have implications for the rest of our lives. For example, in his clinical experience, Grof has found that there is a very strong connection between the sensation of having your life being controlled by other people and being a cesarean baby.
Other birth traumas which can be relived during psychosis are the use of forceps when on your skull when you were a baby, the sensation that you were an unwanted pregnancy by your mother, the various sensations and emotions connected to a long and difficult delivery, like the feeling that you're being strangled or suffocated. These can be experienced as well. And even the use of alcohol, drugs, or smoking during pregnancy is something that you may regress into in order to heal. Now, the next set of regressions I'm going to talk about completely defy the mechanics of mainstream science and are completely rejected by psychiatry and mainstream psychology today. According to Groff, Perry, and many of the people who write me on my YouTube channel, there is a return to biological and organic origins that many people seem to go through as well, myself included. It's not uncommon for people to feel strong connections with their ancestors or other tribal peoples as they regress. They may have the sensation that they've experienced a past life or that they lived in another time or another place. It's very common for people to take on lower life forms, particularly animal personalities, especially apes. And in one particular case, a guy wrote me and he just told me he had the need to go down in his basement and just move around like a lizard. There can also be the sensation of having strong connections with plants or even all of life in all of creation. And along with the more earthly or planetary regressions to our origins, we also have regressions to our cosmic origins as well. People have the sensation that they've gone back to the beginning of time and space with the Big Bang. Or like I did, that they're somehow traveling through the cosmos. Other people just have this grander connection of cosmic consciousness. And then on the other end, we have people who seem to have the sensation that they're being encountered or even possessed by aliens, which isn't always a pleasant experience. Perhaps the most spiritual aspect of an acute psychosis is the actual encounter of spirits themselves. Many people have the apparent hallucination of seeing angels or seeing devils or demons of some kind. Other people feel that the spirits are near them, and often they have some sort of message for the person related to their life purpose or a vision of some type. Others feel that they're actually channeling spirits when they're in a state. And then finally, and we've seen this a few times, people have the feeling, particularly that the devil is inside them and trying to get out. To the outsider, watching someone in psychosis working with a support person, it could seem like the whole process is a whole lot more like an exorcism than it is like therapy. Now, along with releasing the repressions and traumas that we've already talked about, there's also the release of the physical energy that's associated with these traumas. And these energies are released by simply allowing the person in psychosis to do what they intuitively want to do, provided that they're not hurting themselves or other people. And as most episodes start with people in a high energy level, they may want to do some physical exercise or get them running, something like that. But then there's other deeper energies, things like physical tremors or vibrations that are just happening within the body itself. And these tremors and vibrations can be accompanied by cathartic screaming or singing or even vocalizing of particular sounds that for some reason you just feel motivated to make. You just want to make that noise. Even vomiting can occasionally occur as the person releases the biochemicals that are associated with their traumas. When a person has a volcanic eruption of physical energy coming out of them, sometimes afterwards there's like a blackout period where they just go away. And whereas in that situation families or doctors may panic and try and revive the person, Dr. Groff recognizes the blackout as the period of healing in itself and lets the person come back on their own. Another way that the body spontaneously releases traumatic energy while you're in psychosis is that it accelerates your heartbeat. And when that happens spontaneously for no other reason, you immediately start to breathe quicker. You start to hyperventilate. And that hyperventilation increases the oxygen, which releases trauma. The release of Kundalini energies can also be part of this process. I'm going to talk about my Kundalini experience in another video, but for now just know that they feel like very strong energies of heat or even cold that are moving through your body in a very powerful way. Along with the physical energy, we also need the release of the mental or creative energy that's within us. As we all know, people in mania have lots of ideas, and when a person's in a psychosis, the deep flow of psychosis, it's important to share these ideas and express them no matter how crazy they are, and the people supporting us need to be patient and listen instead of trying to shut us up. In order to give your supporters a break, maybe express yourself in your writing, doing writing or artistic expression. I find mandalas very good for allowing people to express themselves. Or even dancing or singing, basically anything creative that can help you express what you're going through as you heal. So is that it? Well, not quite, but I'm out of time. My 10 minutes are up, and you're probably exhausted by now. So while you take a break, I'll get started on part 2 in this series and how we heal our souls during psychosis. And there I'm going to talk about subjects like family secrets and perhaps most controversial of all, how we deal with the violence and aggression that's associated with bipolar disorder. So that's up next. In my last video, I talked about how various traumas, repressions, and different energies need to come out of us during periods of psychosis in order for us to heal bipolar disorder. However, there is one part of the healing that, while not so disturbing for the bipolar person, can be extremely disturbing for our families. So disturbing, in fact, that they could motivate them to want you medicated for your entire life. And what is this horrific thing that needs to be stopped at all costs? The truth. Family secrets. Everybody's got them. And they're not all so horrible. For example, when I found out when I was about 15 that every time my grandfather talked about his time in college, he was actually talking about the time he spent in jail for fraud. As it turned out, for years, college had been the family code word for prison. And then there was the time I found out I was part Micmac Indian. Actually, I found that pretty cool. However, for most of us, the truths we need to talk about during psychosis are much more serious than that. Family secrets such as rape or incest, if mentioned, can tear apart the entire family structure. Now, these secrets could be of a personal nature, like telling the family that you're gay. It could be just stating the obvious, like perhaps that your parents haven't loved each other for 20 years, even though they keep acting like they do. Or it could be something that you did that you consider to be a sin. And it was from working with a few people in psychosis, as well as receiving a lot of emails, that I gained a new appreciation for the ritual of confession within the Catholic Church. Because it became apparent to me that a lot of us, maybe all of us, are carrying around stuff that we want to get off our chest. Now, in my case, my parents were quite receptive to what I had to say, but I know for the most part, parents usually aren't. Typical responses from parents when bipolar people bring up the truth are things like, well, what are you getting so emotional about? Or, you're crazy, your thoughts are wrong. Or, I don't understand you, haven't we given you a good life? These are all ways that the family denies the truth of what the bipolar person is saying. And then to make matters worse, when confronted with all this truth, they take the person to the psychiatrist, who covers the whole thing over with the biggest lie of all, which is that the person is mentally ill. That's why they're having these thoughts and feelings. The reason they're mentally ill is they've got a chemical imbalance, they need drugs, and their thoughts and feelings are basically to be ignored. And of course, this is a huge relief for the family, who can now wash their hands of the whole experience, knowing that there's nothing really wrong with them or their family. The only problem is that their daughter has a little bit too much serotonin going to the brain. Or maybe it's dopamine. Or maybe it's not enough serotonin. I don't know, I get mixed up. So when the opportunity presents itself, clearing of the conscience of personal secrets, family secrets, untold truths, sins of the past, can be a very healing experience when you're in psychosis. Now, there's one family secret that is, in a sense, universal to all families, and yet most people are completely unaware of it. And that secret is that on this planet today, it is highly unlikely that you are going to have two parents that love you unconditionally. What is far more likely, even in the best of families, even in the most healthy of families, is that you may have one parent that loves you unconditionally. You feel their presence of love anytime you're with them, and you feel that you can do no wrong with that one parent, but the other parent will never give you a break, never let you feel like you're completely worthy of their love. If you're doing well in high school, they'll push you, why aren't you getting a part-time job? Once you graduate university, they'll be pushing you to get a full-time job. Then once you've got that, when are you getting married? When are you having kids? When are you planning for your retirement? It never ends. So why does your father or mother do that to you? Why do they hold back love? Well, they don't do it consciously. They do it because their father or mother, your grandparents, held back love from them. And the reason your grandparents held back love is because your great-grandparents held back even more love. In fact, the further you go back in time, generation to generation, what you'll see is an increasing level of general coldness and rigidity among the generations. And that's because the further back you go in your family history, the lower the level of consciousness you will encounter among the people there. And with a lower level of consciousness comes a lower capacity for compassion, not only with your own family, but with other people around you. And the two best examples of this lower level of consciousness is what was going on with women's rights 100 years ago. Basically, women weren't even treated as citizens. And then, of course, there's the racism. You really think Barack Obama would have beat Teddy Roosevelt? Somehow, I think not. Now, please keep in mind when I talk about a generation, I am referring generally, and that in any generation of people or in any culture, some people were ahead of others. So that someone like Abe Lincoln or Nelson Mandela were clearly ahead of the level of consciousness of their own cultures. And what's the end result of receiving this coldness that has come down from our ancestors? Well, it basically leaves us with a feeling of a void in our soul, a sense of emptiness in our life, because we didn't receive all of the unconditional love that we could have when we were young. Now, the good news is that there's a tremendous opportunity to heal this void in the soul when a person's in psychosis. The only trouble is how you go about healing this void in the soul is very controversial in itself. Because what it requires is that when the person in psychosis asks for affectionate love, that love be delivered by the support people or by the therapist. So in practical terms, what that means is that the person in psychosis may look to a supporter for a tremendously warm, affectionate, loving embrace. And while the support person needs to maintain the sacred spirit of the experience, not allowing things to become sexual, the intensity of affection shared could be extremely intimate, the type that we usually only reserve for our lovers. Now, this kind of contact is considered illegal today because of the risk of sexual impropriety, and in fact the great psychiatrist Dr. John Weir Perry lost his license because he was providing this kind of warm affection to female clients. However, Dr. Stangroff insists on the therapeutic benefits of this approach, saying that basically once your soul's void is filled, you're no longer looking for mother figures or father figures in your relationships, and you can find someone that's better suited to your true personality. So just to finish off, whether you're trying to fill this soul's void, or whether you're trying to speak truths or personal secrets that have been hidden for years, both of these movements are trying to bring a deeper level of integrity to your life as you move forward. So while what you're doing or saying may shock people or rock the boat for a short period of time, down the road these movements are going to make for a better life for you, making you healthier and more alive. It'll also allow you to raise your kids, whenever you have them, with a little more warmth than you had growing up. And finally, please remember that while all of these issues have a lot to do with our families, especially our parents, try to keep in mind that chances are if you've got it rough, probably your parents had it even tougher from their parents, and that the people out there with the biggest problems to deal with are the people with no parents at all. Next up, how to deal with and heal aggression during psychosis. Every once in a while, a person with bipolar disorder can get quite aggressive and violent. They may even go into a complete rage. And these aggressive outbursts can even be turned towards themselves in the form of suicide. And as psychiatry would have it, the reasons for these violent outbursts and suicidal tendencies are because you're mentally ill. But if that were the case, how is it that Soteria House was able to take care of over 200 people with acute schizophrenia over 12 years, leaving them completely unmedicated? In fact, the book Soteria reports that only 10 minor injuries happened over that time period among the staff members, and no major injuries at all.
And what on earth was John Weir Perry thinking at his clinic Diabasis, where he created a rage room which encouraged people to get in touch with their anger and express it in a controlled and protective setting? So once again, I found myself a little confused. Did bipolar disorder cause violence, aggression, and suicide? Or was something else going on beneath the surface? So, to get a deeper understanding of this problem, I went to my bipolar friends at newlightbeings.com, a social network, and I asked them, what do you think made you violent or aggressive? And in another question, I asked them what made them think of committing suicide if they had it all. And what I found out from the responses was that, while yes, when the ego collapses and a person goes into psychosis, there is repressed aggression that can occasionally come out. However, for many bipolar people, our aggression doesn't rear its ugly head until we're in the hands of the system that is supposed to be taking care of us. And at least initially, it's usually the system that is a lot more aggressive with us than we are with it. I've never been violent unless you include struggling to get away from the police, who are violent to me. Then once hospitalized, the person in psychosis will often find themselves in the middle of a violent, absurd nightmare. The confrontation with the cold and violent reality of the hospital, restraining, chemical and physical prisons, was just not understandable to me. I only became aggressive when trying to defend myself from needles or other perceived threats. When I got to the hospital, I got strapped to a bed, and the doctor came in with a big needle. I started yelling really hard, "You are killing me! You are Bush!" Speaking personally, I think that my aggression came out of the deep knowledge that I was experiencing something vitally important and sacred, and that my hospitalization was interfering with this process. Or as one new light being described, I believe this rage is some form of primal defense or warning. Try and remove a lion cub from the pride, and the lioness will stop at nothing to kill you. She doesn't display this rage out of love for her cub, no. She's in a rage because you're fucking with evolution. Once through the initial trauma of hospitalization, the bipolar person then has to face their warm and friendly psychiatrist. I got angry in the MD's office with my husband and father. I was trying to talk to my husband and explain my paranoia when the MD told him not to listen to me. That was very insulting and frustrating. It's as if the psychiatric profession has no idea of how sensitive we are when we're in psychosis and how much in need we are of compassion and understanding. I was coming so far from that other dimension that my brain just couldn't manage the information of a world where bad and wrong exist. I was obsessed with the idea of spiritual freedom, and in my view I was being persecuted by the machine in an attempt to suppress me and imprison me in their narrow view of a bleak reality. I felt spiritually raped. And then, if you're lucky enough to get out of the hospital, the medications have an effect all of their own, particularly when you're trying to withdraw off of them. I am certain that my anger, in fact my entire manic episode, was caused when my doctor reduced my meds without proper, gradual tapering. Ritalin is apparently something nobody should go on because it causes uncontrollable fits of rage when it wears off. Effexor, an evil poison if there ever was one. The bipolar new light beings also felt that medications had a very strong connection to the suicidal tendencies as well. Feeling like you're poisoning yourself every time you put a chemical clump of crap into your mouth is a slow form of suicide in some ways, isn't it? It was for me. To me, the reasons for wanting to kill yourself are much more complex, but the relationships to meds can be a hell of a good trigger. But it's not only the world of psychiatry that can make us violent, angry, and suicidal, it's the way we're received by our friends and family as well. Only one of my friends stuck around from that part of my life. What hurts me most is how they look at me like I'm the Frankenstein monster, and how they disregard everything I say because I'm crazy to them. Most of my family talks to me like I'm a dummy, and they're scared to be in the same room with me. Or for those who are more spiritual, they think I'm a witch, and that's why I'm punished for life with this disease. Realizing that my family and friends would only accept me again if I would surrender to lifelong medication, I took an overdose of liquid anesthetic. So while it may not be this way for everybody, many bipolar people, once diagnosed, find themselves marginalized and pathologized by society, and with a much dimmer future than they had planned staring them in the face. Wouldn't you be angry, maybe even suicidal? I was helpless and alone and angry and pretty out of myself.
They tied me up to a bed to make sure I didn't try that again.
Back in the 80s, when I was at the University of Toronto, I did 2 research reports on why normal people commit suicide, not necessarily people with bipolar disorder. And what I found among these so-called normal suicidal people was that the main reason that they wanted to kill themselves was exactly the same as why a bipolar person would want to kill themselves: infinite hopelessness. In the long run, the worst message you can give to a human being is to tell them that their psychological and spiritual problems are biochemical disorders or diseases, because it disempowers them. Dr. Peter Bregan, author of Your Drug May Be Your Problem. So, with this deeper understanding of why people are aggressive and suicidal, maybe we can start to understand this suicide note written by one of our new light beings. I beg for God to please have mercy on my soul. My soul is only the victim of my mind. Please release me of this world that shows no mercy to me, and allow my body to lay in the ground. Float my soul to the sky. Forgive me of my sins. I have been in agonizing pain for 12 years.
Fortunately for all of us, especially her son, Allison survived that suicide attempt, and actually attributes the survival to a new, more spiritual outlook on life. Allison, I hope you don't mind me stealing a few words from your page at New Light Beings. My internal suffering has saved my soul. I am deeply and madly in love with this soulful ride I experience inside my human shell. So am I, Allison. So am I.
Why can't mainstream psychiatry or psychology heal bipolar disorder? Why do religions continually demonize mental illness? Why is the experience of a manic episode treated as meaningless when it feels so meaningful? The answer to these and many other questions is quite simple, really. We are still evolving. Evolution used to be a word on the tip of everybody's tongue when we were growing into the modern world. Remember Charles Darwin and survival of the fittest and all that? And certainly it looked like, for a time there, with the advances of science, that clearly evolution was in progress, and we were certainly making material progress. There's no doubt about that. However, in my opinion, starting in the 1980s, people started to look around and wonder what exactly we were doing on the planet. Is this the way we want to evolve? We're working harder than ever. We're totally stressed out. We're stuck in traffic. We're polluting the environment. We're destroying all the wildlife on the planet. And I know I'm not the only one who's looked around and thought, is this evolution? Something has gone seriously wrong. Maybe at some point in history we had made a wrong turn somehow, or maybe we should have stayed in agricultural, pre-industrial society, or maybe we should have stayed in tribal society where we were one with nature, even if we didn't know how to read. So with all this said, I was greatly relieved to find the work of Ken Wilber, who, starting with his book, A Brief History of Everything, really set me straight about how we are evolving, and that while scientific materialist society, the society that really runs our world today, is clearly in decline, what are emerging are more open, loving, spiritual levels of consciousness, and these levels of consciousness are absolutely critical for helping us to understand why we've had this huge upsurge in bipolar disorder in the last 15 years, and how for the first time since we left that tribal Garden of Eden, we are actually able to heal bipolar disorder without psychiatry in the midst of our own friends and in our own homes. So what are these so-called spiritual levels of consciousness? Well, like Ken Wilber, I prefer to borrow from the work of Dr. Clare Graves, who spent his entire career sociologically verifying the existence of these different levels of consciousness on our planet. His theory of consciousness he calls spiral dynamics. Dr. Graves discovered that there are basically 7 different realities on our planet today, 7 different levels of consciousness, where people work and live and think and operate from 7 completely different perspectives. He also anticipates that even higher levels of consciousness will emerge in the future. As you will see once I get into the descriptions, these levels of consciousness really function almost like a series of Russian dolls, where in the beginning of existence we started with this very limited sense of consciousness of who we are, and then at certain points in our evolution we in a sense shed the skin or shed the shell of this Russian doll in order to have a deeper, more meaningful experience of life. Now, I know some people are going to have a problem with this idea of hierarchy being here, but what you need to understand is that without hierarchy, there is no growth. Think about your own life. Are you the same person now that you were when you were 10 years old or when you were 5 years old? No, you've grown in your evolution of consciousness. And people understand that when we talk about growing up through childhood. But when we actually look at adults and we say, oh, one adult is more conscious than another adult, then we get into problems. We clearly understand this with our education system, where we start in first year, like grade school, then we move up to high school, then on to university, and then possibly a master's program. A master's program, in this sense, is clearly better than grade school. So while we get this with our education system, the idea that you personally have a limited level of consciousness which needs to grow or will grow eventually, many people or most people will find very disturbing. Even I find it disturbing. Unfortunately, developing your own consciousness isn't always as easy as simply picking up a book. Sometimes we really need to let our old ways die and break out of that shell, or in this case, our box. So here's a quick introductory look at the 7 different levels of consciousness introduced in spiral dynamics. Level 1, archaic. Back 50,000 years ago, the world was a very dangerous place, and all these guys could do was just fight to stay alive day to day. And how did they survive? Well, just on their instincts. They didn't have a brain to think too much, so their focus was just get food, water, warmth, have sex, safety, find a cave. That's it. It didn't get much deeper than that for the caveman. Level 2, tribal. Now, what's so wizardly about the tribal level of consciousness? Well, 10,000 years ago, when the tribal level was very strong, these people saw the world in an entirely magical way. Now, it wasn't always good magic, but it was always magic. And the magic was used to influence the spirits, the spirit world, which was everywhere. So the big mission in their life was to keep the spirits happy so that the tribe could be safe. So in order to keep them happy, a big focus of their lives were obeying the spirits, being very obedient, and as well obedient to their ancestors, their chief, their elders, their entire tribe. They needed to respect and honor the tribe, and part of that involved participating in the sacred rituals and rites of passage ceremonies for the tribe. Level 3, feudal. Freed from the constraints of the tribe, my world now is all about me, and my mission is to get whatever I want. And doing that ain't easy because it's a jungle out there, so you need to demand respect. And with so much of their focus on self-gratification, these guys know how to party better than any other level. That is until level 4 comes along, because the traditional level of consciousness will show you the error of your ways. At this point, the world becomes purposeful, and your mission is to live your life with a sense of morality. I mean, what's going to happen to you after you die? Are you going to go to hell, or are you going to go to heaven? So at the traditional level, people start to control their impulsivity by following the moral code of their religion, and hopefully if they've been good, they'll get salvation in the afterlife. And now, even though there's a lot of guilt that comes with this level, because you know you're a sinner, you know you've been a bad boy, in the long run, it builds character. It really does. So while religion does build character with its morality, some of the beliefs associated with these religions, they don't have any scientific basis. So at level 5, the modern level, it is science that becomes the religion. Our new world becomes about achieving success, not only in our eyes, but especially in the eyes of others. The new mission becomes to play the game to win, and to play by the rules, unless you can cheat without getting caught. At this point, both societies and individuals prosper with the advances that come from technology and a marketplace that is highly competitive. Unlike previous levels, change becomes a natural, ongoing part of life with constant innovation, and the whole point is to create the good life. Screw the planet. Recognizing that for many of us, the ways of the modern world have meant the internet superhighway to nowhere, along comes level 6, the postmodern level. And at this point, for the first time ever, all of a sudden it seems like we can see the world from many truths. Up until now, every level has thought that it just had the answer. But these people see the world in pluralistic terms, many truths, many moralities. Who's right? Who's wrong? Who knows? So the mission here is to bring harmony through understanding. And for the first time ever, we're really listening to each other. And for the first time since science told you that God doesn't really exist, you start to awaken to a new sense of spirituality, and you return to the deeper questions of the meaning in life and start to question your material focus on just solely money, status, and power. Like, is that the only reason we're here, just to survive? And along with checking out other cultures and other ways of doing things in your quest, you might just step in and try and help the planet Earth heal a little bit along the way. Now, Level 6 is convinced there's many ways to look at the world, many truths, but there's only one problem. None of the other levels see it that way. So they're always fighting with them. They fight with people for being narrow-minded. So as a result, they're fighting with just about 80% of the world's population, because for the rest of us, there are no other realities. There's my reality. Screw the rest. You're all wrong. And that's part of what makes Level 7 so interesting, is that for the first time in human history, we have a growing population of people who are not fighting with other levels of consciousness. Part of the reason is they see value in all the other levels. They see value in multiple perspectives, in morality, in success, in egotistic impulse. They see value in survival and security. Every level has its reason for being, and every level has value. So at Level 7, people stop being so damn manipulative. They stop trying to force people to be what they're not. They leave people as they are, and when there's an opening for them to grow, they try and help them out. That's about it. Also, unlike the other levels, they're not so focused on trying to become something. They're not trying to do things to strive to become something better than they are. They recognize that the joy of life and success in life come from putting all of your focus and all of your energy into where you are right now. Just like Eckhart Tolle's book says, the power of now. So that's why I'm calling this level the power of now level. The world they see is one of integrated levels of consciousness where each has value, and your mission is to just be. In practical terms, this just being means putting a lot of passionate involvement into what you're doing right now, but not with a striving attitude trying to be something you're not. This attitude brings a very flexible approach to life, so you're not thinking, okay, I need to do this in order to get this. In this way, life becomes much more spontaneous, because the focus isn't so much in worrying about what's the correct way to do things, but in simply which way is going to work best. And with a lot less worrying in your life, life becomes much more playful and creative. It's almost like you can pour everything into what you're doing, but you're not so worried about the outcomes. Okay, that's it. That's your 7 levels of consciousness. Now in my next video in this series, I'm going to demonstrate how different levels of consciousness interpret mental illness, particularly bipolar disorder, and why people at the higher levels of consciousness are in a position where they can help support people with bipolar disorder so that they can heal. So what does bipolar disorder have to do with different levels of consciousness? Well, it turns out a lot. And to illustrate my point, the first thing I'm going to do is talk to you about the different people we worked with who had bipolar disorder this year. So the first person I'll talk about is my younger niece, who I will call here Anna. It's really her story that got me involved in this subject in the first place. Now, for those of you who don't know me, 12 years ago I was sent to a psychiatric hospital with an experience that other people saw as insanity, but I was sure was very beneficial to me. I eventually discovered that what I had had was not a mental illness at all, but what was called a spiritual emergency. Dr. Stan Groff, Dr. David Lukoff, and others recommend that spiritual emergencies not be medicated or hospitalized because allowing them to process can be very beneficial to the person in crisis. Now, before my wife and I met Anna, she had already been in her experience for 3 days and was already being heavily medicated by psychiatry. So my big question at the time was Anna mentally ill, or was she having an experience like my own, something like a spiritual emergency? To start, our experiences had a lot more similarities than there were differences. We both went through periods of high energy levels, had a strong desire to take off our clothes. Our sense of taste, smell, vision, all of that heightened. We had strong feelings of euphoria during the experience, and we both became extremely emotional. As far as differences go, the biggest difference was in our background. I had had my crisis at the age of 30, and I had been university educated and well-traveled by then. And she had her crisis when she was only 17 years old and just leaving high school, going on to university.
If there was one big difference, it was how we approached the experience. I saw mine as a deeply sacred thing, and I knew it was a special thing to go through. And while she had some spiritual aspects, on the whole, she was experiencing a lot of fear. She was afraid to go upstairs in her own house without her mother with her. That's how disturbed she was by the experience. And while I did take strong action to understand what happened to me, I avoided seeing psychologists or psychiatrists because I didn't think they understood what happened to me, and I didn't take any medication after my 3-day hospitalization. Anna, on the other hand, was quite quick to comply with what her parents and psychiatrist wanted her to do. She's been seeing a psychiatrist and psychologist and has been medicated indefinitely. Convinced that Anna was not mentally ill, I went to work studying the difference between a spiritual emergency, which is what I had had and been so beneficial, and this bipolar disorder, this thing called bipolar disorder that she was being labeled with. And thanks to the YouTube community, I discovered that many people who have been labeled with bipolar disorder had experiences in acute psychosis that were identical to my own spiritual emergency. Along with the symptoms Anna showed, there can be experiences of oneness and timelessness, a sense of all-knowing the universe, and even a sacredness to the experience. You can experience delusions and hallucinations, usually of a spiritual nature. You will also think that you're dreaming or in some sort of a play or a dream world, and in this dream world you will want to test reality, which could lead you to want to walk through walls or even smash your car. Other symptoms can include the sense that you're being tested by God, that you're the Messiah, the prophet, or a saint. More and more, it looked like spiritual emergencies and bipolar disorder were the same thing. And then, just as I was figuring all this stuff out, Anna's older sister, Eliana, had an experience of her own. And once again, the initial symptoms were identical to Anna's and my own. And Ileana strongly conveyed the experiences of the spiritual emergency as well, the oneness, timelessness, delusions, testing reality. Now, knowing what had happened to her sister, once her crisis got deeper, she called us immediately, and we supported her for 5 days, completely unmedicated and without hospitalization. Now, to my surprise, Ileana had much deeper experiences than I did. She had very deep out-of-body experiences, which had her feeling no pain for 3 days, even though she was bumping into things. She felt that she was in her mother's womb and actually started to re-experience the birth happening all over again. In general, even though most of her experience with us was quite pleasant, once she came back, she was quite disturbed and frightened by the whole thing. While the bulk of her psychosis happened in the first manic episode, she would go on to have 2 more, and it was only after the third psychosis, which happened about 2 months later, that she was able to feel that she had a genuine rebirth and was finally able to get back to normal life. So the whole thing took about 2 months. Based on this limited experience, one thing became very clear, which is that Ileana never would have made it through her process without our aggressive interventions. And yet, for some reason, I had been able to get through this experience totally unsupported. How? My first clue came when I started talking to Anna, and I realized that she didn't recognize any sacredness to the experience that she had been going through, like I had 12 years earlier. And in talking to her about God, it became very clear that her God was quite a concrete Jesus figure. Jesus was God for her, and this is the person she prayed to for guidance. So like all people at the traditional level of consciousness, her approach to the divine was clearly a religious one. And in the religious mindset, God is clearly above you and separate from you, and for people to have an experience of God is a very rare thing that only tends to happen to prophets, saints, these sort of people. So for anyone of the traditional religious mindset, the first thought is that an actual experience of God is in fact impossible. It's a lot more likely that what's happening to you is the work of the devil. Now, in contrast to Anna, I had moved into the postmodern level of consciousness at about the age of 28. At that point in time, I awakened to the fact that while God could be outside of you, God could also be within you. And as a result, when I went into my psychosis 2 years later, the sacredness of it was unmistakable. So whereas I was able to trust this process and go with it, Anna was very unsure of what was happening and trusted the authority figures who told her to stop it immediately. And in her case, these authority figures were at the modern level. That's where our medical model is today. And similar to the traditional level, any psychosis, spiritual or otherwise, should be blocked immediately, not because it's the work of the devil, but because it's a malfunction of your biological machinery. And it was at this modern level that Eliana had been exploring reality. Much like a social scientist, she had been traveling France recently and found the culture there fascinating and found herself a little bit confused as to what was the truth, which was the proper way to live, the right way to live, the French way or the Brazilian way, which way was right. And unlike traditional people that always carry a cultural bias, Eliana was looking at things in a very objective, factual way. And with this rational approach to life, she really showed her modern level of consciousness. Now, while all this was happening, I was getting a lot of email coming in through YouTube, and by now I've probably talked to over 200 people who have had some sort of psychosis. And one thing was very surprising. Some people were making it through, as I had, unsupported. They were healing, and what was really interesting was that all of these people that were healing were fitting into the postmodern level of consciousness. Just like the postmodern profile, these people had a deeper interest in spirituality than normal, and when their experiences came, they often did come related to some sort of spiritual practice or insight that came related to their relationship with God. They were almost always university educated, and generally over the age of 25. Almost all of them were over the age of 25. And how did they do it? Well, they recognized it for the sacred experience that it was, and they surrendered to the process. Now, I want to remind you that this was a small group of people among the postmodern types that had this rebirth as I did and came through unmedicated. Everyone else was having their process blocked, either by the psychiatry and psychology of the modern level, by the religion of the traditional level, or even by their own fears. So, how do levels of consciousness affect bipolar disorder? Well, for one, it's only at the postmodern level of consciousness that we start to open up to the possibility of a positive spiritual manic experience. And as a result of this open attitude, some postmoderns are able to heal their disorder without support, simply by surrendering to the experience with faith. In contrast, people at the modern and traditional levels cannot heal without support because their level of consciousness is not prepared for this spiritual experience. And neither are the institutions of mainstream psychiatry, mainstream psychology, and organized religions, all of which harm what should be a sacred healing process. However, healing is possible for people at other levels, with loving support and a level 7 power of now approach to this psychosis. And that's what I'm going to talk about next. So, what is this revolutionary new power of now approach to healing bipolar disorder? Just be. Be with the people that are in psychosis and truly connect with them. Dr. Loren Mosher knew what I was talking about back in the 70s when he based the whole approach at Soteria House, a place for healing people with acute schizophrenia, on the idea of being with the person in crisis as opposed to doing something to them. Moshe writes, Soteria saw the person in psychosis as someone to be with, tolerated, interacted with, indeed appreciated. Dr. John Weir Perry at his project Diabasis, which he talks about in his book Trials of a Visionary Mind, took a very similar approach with the extra added step of not only being with the person in psychosis, but encouraging them to deeply engage what they are encountering in their mystical experiences. Perry writes, the intention of such therapy is to honor what the other person experiences with a readiness to receive her whole being, to relate to all that is in her, and thus to share in her psychic life and be in it with her during this critical period of growth. Now let's compare that approach to that of the late and not so great Sigmund Freud. From Peter Kramer's book, Freud, Inventor of the Modern Mind, Freud is quoted as saying, I cannot advise my colleagues too urgently to model themselves during psychoanalytic treatment on the surgeon who puts aside all feelings, even his human sympathy. Apparently, Freud's modern mind is far behind the times. The importance of being with people empathetically as opposed to doing something to them was found to be so critical that it was actually college undergraduates making, on today's dollars, about $10 an hour that were found to be actually more effective than trained and licensed psychiatrists or psychologists in helping people through their acute psychosis. Because they are unburdened by preconceived theories, non-professional staff members are free to be themselves and to be spontaneous with psychotic individuals. In contrast, highly trained mental health personnel often replace this freedom with cognitive, abstract, learned responses that can invalidate the patient's experience. So if you're looking to heal your bipolar disorder, it certainly seems that this guy will be a lot more effective than this guy in helping you heal. Now, to actually be able to just be in the present moment with somebody is a remarkably simple thing to do. And in truth, each of us have glimpses of living in the present moment every single day of our lives. We're just not aware of it. For example, any time we're in a really meaningful conversation that energizes us, we're in the present moment. We're just being in the present moment. Anytime we find ourselves working on a project that initially we thought of as maybe a lot of work, but then we find that we're actually enjoying the process, that's being in the present moment. Whenever you spontaneously tell a joke that just makes everybody crack up, that's being in the present moment. I know I'm in the present moment whenever I visit a new city and start to explore it for the first time. But in truth, any activity in your life can be one in which you are in the present moment, and the easiest way to tell if you're in the present moment is to look at your watch. So far, this video has been about 3.5 minutes. Now for you, has it been a fast 3.5 minutes or a slow 3.5 minutes? If the time seemed to go by quickly or you didn't notice the time passing at all, you're in the present moment. But if you're looking at that little clock in the lower right-hand corner and you're wondering how much longer I'm going to be and you're thinking about where you've got to be next, you are not in the present moment. In fact, where you are, or where your attention is, I should say, is either in the future or in the past, usually worrying about the future and often because of what happened in the past. Now, there is one person that is always in the present moment, and that is the person who's in an acute psychosis. For the person in psychosis, they seem to be living in an eternal now. They have no sense of time whatsoever. And as a support person, if you're not being with the person in psychosis in that present moment, they can really feel it, because to them it feels like a coldness or a hostility that you're emitting. And they will often react to you in a very negative or even violent way. Conversely, when you are being with them, simply being, that is a state of love. And they can feel that love and will respond to it in a very positive way. Now, while just being sounds simple, it's not always so easy when put into practice for most people. I mean, as a supporter, would you be able to simply be in the present moment as you watch the person in psychosis piss all over your Persian rug? Would you be able to stay in the present moment watching someone who's your boyfriend or girlfriend put their arms around another support person and express genuine love and affection for that person and not you? Will you stay in the present moment when your friend takes all their clothes off and tries to jump out the window? Most people in these situations are simply going to hit the panic button, call an ambulance, call the police, get them over there, and just wipe their hands of it. That's why the ideal support person needs to be someone who's got an extremely warm and empathetic heart, and yet can stay as cool as a cucumber when the shit hits the fan. Now, up until now, I've talked about this level 7 Power of Now level as being a new awakening of consciousness, and in a sense it is for the culture, but that awareness has been with us for thousands of years. Various shaman, mystics, yogis, and monks from around the world have been aware of the importance of being rather than doing for anyone that wants to have a lasting sense of inner peace. The Japanese practice of Zen Buddhism is completely focused on the exercise of pushing yourself into the here and now. In the Chinese scripture, the Tao Te Ching, to simply be was to be the equivalent of being one with God, or as they called it, one with the Tao. The Tao pours everything into life. It is a cornucopia that never runs dry. It is the deep source of everything. It is nothing and yet in everything. 30 years ago, the importance of this highly spiritual approach to living was not lost on John Weir Perry. In the field of therapy of all kinds, we have a good deal to learn from Taoism. This doctrine's mode of being in the world is a way of action that does not force effects but allows them. Now, many people have theorized about why this approach to healing psychosis has not caught on as it should have, being much more effective than leaving people medicated for their entire lives. And in my opinion, most of the voices in the anti-psychiatry movement have pointed to the money and influence of Big Pharma as being the reason why this type of approach hasn't spread. However, it's my opinion that being primarily a modern culture, we simply haven't reached the level of consciousness yet where we can do the kind of work that's needed on a widespread basis. 10 years ago, the book Spiral Dynamics estimated that there was only about 1 or 2% of people operating at the Power of Now level, level 7, with another 10 to 15% operating at the postmodern level. Everyone else was functioning at the modern level or lower. So in other words, even today in 2008, for the vast majority of people, the very idea of simply being with somebody in an acute psychosis as opposed to doing something to them will be completely absurd and unacceptable. Or as Sigmund Freud said, if one wanted to make a living from the treatment of nervous ailments, one had to do something for them.
So while the bad news is that many people have suffered at the hands of psychiatry for the last 100 years, totally misunderstood, the good news is that things are changing, and they are changing very quickly. At the beginning of the 20th century, I think it's very safe to say that probably 90% of the world's population was at the traditional level of consciousness and lower. It's only in the last 100 years that we've had the modern, the postmodern, and the power of now level all become part of our society. So, as more people are evolving into the postmodern and power of now levels of consciousness, we're going to have more people that are able to understand what needs to happen and are capable of doing it. Or let me correct that, are capable of doing nothing, just being. For those of you out there who are still struggling with this idea of just being, I highly recommend Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now. It's really addressed at people that are having specific concerns with this idea and are trying to apply it to their own life. And if you're interested in how I came to adopt this philosophy, you could pick up my book, A Quiet Mind, A Mystic Journey Out of Insanity, which coincidentally started with my psychosis. For additional information on any of the books I mentioned in my videos, you can check out my Bipolar or Waking Up blog, where I have a book list on the right-hand side. About a year ago, here on Bipolar Waking Up, I set a goal for myself, and that goal was to put together the entire puzzle of bipolar disorder one video at a time. And as I've done over 10 theory videos on bipolar disorder, I thought it might be a good time to take a look at each of those pieces that I've created and start to put them together so that you can see the bigger picture. And as I talk about one video after another, I've provided links so that if you want to get into more details and see one video in particular, you can do so. Now, while I have made one video on depression so far, my focus really has been on the mania side, particularly the acute psychosis or period of insanity that can happen to people when they're in a state of mania. Now, as many of you are aware, these states of acute psychosis are considered incurable by psychiatry and will require a lifetime of medication. However, it's my opinion that these episodes are deeply misunderstood by psychiatry and that they in fact can be healed. In fact, I've healed from one myself, and that's what my story, Am I Bipolar or Waking Up, was all about. Then, after realizing that so many of you had had experiences so similar to my own, I thought I would share the theories of transpersonal psychologists, especially Dr. Stan Grof and Dr. John Weir Perry. Both of these doctors had spent a lifetime healing mental illness, not medicating it. So with my first theory video, I thought I'd tackle how these acute psychoses start in the first place. And as opposed to psychiatry, which tells you that you've got a chemical imbalance and that was the cause, I put forward the idea that I've learned from these doctors and has reflected my own experience, which is that an acute psychosis starts with a collapse of the ego. So in the video, The Real Cause of Bipolar Disorder, I start out by explaining what exactly an ego is, and it's quite different than most mainstream psychiatrists and psychologists lead you to believe. And so it's here that I'd introduce the idea that the ego is the false self. It's who you think you are, but you're not. And the analogy I give is that it's as if you're a baby chick that thinks you are the eggshell. You're not the eggshell. The eggshell is there to protect you and help you grow, but at some point the eggshell becomes limiting and you need to break out of it. Now, once into an acute psychosis, the experience can be quite fearful and disturbing for the person. However, what's rarely talked about among psychiatry or psychologists is that there are many experiences that are deeply spiritual. So in the video, Is Bipolar Mania Spiritual Enlightenment?, I start to compare the experience of being in psychosis with the experience that many Buddhist monks have of actually achieving enlightenment. And as you'll see, there are many parallels, including feelings of timelessness and a oneness or connection with the universe, a feeling of being tested by God or even being God. All of this can be present in a psychosis, and this can be present in experiences of enlightenment as well. And then in part 2 of Is Bipolar Mania Spiritual Enlightenment, I go on to explain how the complex inner feelings and thoughts that we have while in psychosis, as sacred as they can be sometimes, often motivate us to act very strangely. And because we behave so strangely and often are very uncooperative, the people around us, especially our families, the parents, and police, don't treat us with the love and compassion that we need to get through this process. Rather, they treat us like problems that need to be solved and silenced.
Then, in the video Why We're Bipolar Normal Life Sucks, I start to take a deeper look at the underlying causes of bipolar disorder, such as the emotional issues that surface during the psychosis. And what we find initially is that while the psychosis does start with a collapse of the ego, it does so because your psyche is attempting to resolve a tension that exists between who you really are, your soul or true self, and who you think you need to be in order to survive in this world, your false self or ego. Because of this inner tension, many bipolar people have this feeling that they don't really have bipolar disorder, but that they have I can't be me disorder. So, in order to resolve this tension between the soul and the ego, the first thing that has to happen is that we need to start allowing our periods of acute psychosis to play themselves out in safe environments. Unfortunately, as we all know in our society today, we're not allowed to enter into these periods of psychosis because we see no value in them. In fact, according to psychiatry, being in psychosis can actually cause brain damage, and they say this without having any scientific proof of that whatsoever. So, in the video How to Heal Bipolar Mania, I discuss the value of such experiences and how they can lead to spiritual breakthroughs for people that make it through the experiences successfully. Then, starting in 2009, I began to outline in detail the exact experiences which in fact do heal if someone is allowed to enter into the psychotic process in a supportive environment. In Traumas, Repressions, and the Healing of Bipolar Disorder, I outline how various traumas and repressed feelings from adulthood, childhood, and even our birth process are relived and healed during psychosis. I also discuss very otherworldly experiences such as feeling connected to the cosmos and sensations from other cultures, times, and places, which also have strong emotionally healing significance. In Family Secrets in the Healing of Bipolar Disorder, I talk about how the untold truths of our lives and our family relationships are part of the underlying problems that cause our disorder. Of particular focus is the cold hard parenting that many of us grow up with, and this style of parenting leaves us with the feeling of having an inner void that we seek to fulfill within our daily life. Then, in Aggression, Suicide, and the Healing of Bipolar Disorder, I talk about how these often violent and destructive feelings can come up in a manic episode as well, especially when they're connected to the traumas and repressions and family secrets I've already talked about. However, after doing extensive online research with bipolar people, I believe that much like the other traumas, repressions, etc., the feelings of anger and the violent feelings need to be worked through in psychosis as well, and that in fact these feelings usually become much worse once a person's in contact with psychiatry. And as you'll see when you watch the video, that it certainly seems like the psychiatric approach to labeling people mentally ill and medicating them for life appears to be causing more suicides than it's preventing. Now, if everything I've said up to now is true, why is it that so few people have this understanding of bipolar disorder? Well, the answer to that is we are still evolving. In part 1 of my series on bipolar disorder and consciousness, I introduced the idea that from the beginning of history we have been gradually evolving through different levels of consciousness laid out in a theory called spiral dynamics. And in part 1 of the series I introduced the theory describing each level of consciousness one at a time. Then in part 2 of the series I provide some specific examples of different people at different levels of consciousness, and then I'm able to make a comparison between the people at a higher level of consciousness who are able to heal their bipolar disorder as compared to those at lower levels that usually fall victim to the psychiatric system, which is at the lower modern level of consciousness. And the key point I make in the video is that according to psychiatry and our modern level of consciousness, the only things that are real are what can be measured. And as a result, when they look for the source of a problem or a disorder, they need to look at the human being as an entirely biological organism. Now, mainstream psychiatry continues to hang on to this materialist belief system despite a number of problems with their theory, and the biggest problem of which is that some people heal from their disorder. And many of these people not only heal, but they consider it a breakthrough in their lives and are grateful for the experience. And for those who do heal, the message they send back for the rest of us is very clear. This acute psychosis is a spiritual experience. And so in order to have a true breakthrough while you're in psychosis, you need to approach the psychosis as a spiritually healing process which requires a higher level of consciousness. And what's even more exciting here is that people who are not really psychologically prepared to go through this process alone can have breakthroughs if they're properly supported. And to support an episode properly, you need to follow the advice of Power of Now author Eckhart Tolle and simply be in the present moment. And in part 3 of my series on bipolar disorder and consciousness, that's where I talk about how you support somebody by simply being with them as opposed to doing something to them when they're in an acute psychosis. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that so far I've put together a pretty big part of this puzzle, but I'm not done yet. So what I want to do is tell you what I've got in store for future videos. Well, first, in a sense, I feel like I haven't even told you half the story. I still need to talk about the meaning and causes of delusions, hallucinations, and those ever-present synchronicities that so many of us seem to experience while we're in psychosis. I need to do a real good job on the subject of paranoia because it's such an important subject and can really get in the way of the healing, so I'll be asking my friends at New Light Beings to help me out with that one. I want to show you guys a model I've come up with, which I think does a good job of describing the difference between spiritual emergencies, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. I haven't even mentioned what I feel is behind this huge surge in bipolar disorder cases, especially among the young. And perhaps most importantly, I haven't said a word about what I know many of my subscribers are already feeling, that this surge in bipolar disorder is a part of our global spiritual evolution, and that those of you who are suffering at the hands of psychiatry today could be the pioneers of a whole new culture, a whole new society, a whole new way of being for all of us. But before I can even start to discuss any of those topics, we need to take a step back, right back to the very beginning. At the end of my last video, Solving the Bipolar Disorder Puzzle, I touched on the idea that bipolar disorder is actually part of a bigger evolutionary movement happening among mankind, and that to understand this idea, we really need to go back to the very beginning. But after thinking about it, I realized that we need to go back even further. A little further. Further. No, that's too far back. Okay, that's better. Okay, I don't know about you, but I love coral reefs, and one of the things I love about them is that somehow there's sort of a cross between a plant and an animal. And yet, while it looks like a plant, as you swim by, often its active instinctive consciousness is unmistakable. And the reason is that if you get too close, the whole coral will recoil in fear. And in this way, coral reefs, humans, and every life form in between have one thing in common. When we sense danger, we shut down. We'll do whatever is necessary to protect ourselves from what's threatening us. Now, in the animal kingdom, that behavior could be related to the fight or flight mechanism, where the animal will either run away or attack. However, for us so-called humans, our normal behavior usually doesn't involve attacking. Rather, most of the time we just start to act like an asshole when we feel threatened. When threatened, we'll usually try and manipulate or intimidate people we think we can control that are threatening us. Or we might play nice and friendly to their face, only to screw them behind their back. And sometimes, like the reef, we'll just shut down and act like everything's okay when it's clearly not okay. And then after that, we'll usually follow it up with some nice passive-aggressive behavior, which used to be my specialty. Now, on the other hand, when we feel safe and protected, we open ourselves to life and can feed ourselves. But unlike the coral, which is basically looking to feed itself with just food, humans are looking to feed themselves with food as well as a variety of other things as well. Things like our relationships with family and friends, our creativity, our curiosity, and our passion. And when these things get fed, life becomes enjoyable, spontaneous, and even carefree. And when we are open like this, we are in a state of love. And this love can manifest itself into many forms. Into peace and happiness, into laughter, and perhaps most importantly, into compassion for others. Not only our own family, but our neighbors, people of other races, cultures and belief systems, even other life forms, including that coral reef. And in our love, we feel connected and alive.
and to feel alive is truly living in the present moment. So by now I hope you've figured out that love and fear are not just things that we do, but are entire states of being. And in a state of love, we're relaxed, whereas in a state of fear, we're tense. The state of love is an attracting force. The state of fear is a separating force. And where love is freeing, fear is controlling. And where love is accepting, fear is judgmental. And as a result, love is a healing process, whereas fear is hurtful. And this healing is integrating and cooperative, whereas the fear is destructive and competitive. Needless to say, love comes from the spiritual and fear purely the physical. And like I said, love is open and fear is closed. And when you look at it this way, it seems like such a simple choice. Choose love, not fear. Simple. But the truth is that choosing love over fear is hardly that easy. And that most people today are living lives which are much more fear-driven than they even realize. And the reason for this is that the amount of time during our daily lives that we spend in a state of fear and that we spend in a state of love is directly related to our level of consciousness. Because as we're evolving, we're moving from more fearful, closed states, which deal with a more narrow reality, to more open, loving states, which deal with a much broader reality. Let me give you a more concrete example. Imagine this boring gray circle represents all of reality, all of the infinite possibilities of our world today. But you're living at the tribal or magical level of consciousness that I've already described in my videos on bipolar disorder and consciousness. Now, during your daily life, when you're having experiences which fit into the everyday routine of your own culture, you're going to accept them and you're not going to have a problem with that. However, almost all experiences or encounters that happen outside of your everyday tribal reality will be rejected. And the reason is that your ego filters out the unaccepted reality. So in this sense, whatever is within the ego, we are open to and receptive in a state of love. And whatever is outside the borders of our reality, outside the ego, we are closed to and respond to with a state of fear. Now, fortunately for us modern people, we pass through this tribal level of consciousness quite quickly at a fairly young age. Speaking personally, I was through the tribal level probably around the age of 3 or 4, then on to the feudal level where I stayed until about 8 or 9 years old, then into the conformist traditional level, which held my attention probably until about the age of 16 or 17. Then I stayed in the modern level probably right through university and into my early working years at like 26, 27 years old. My first taste of the multiple perspective postmodern level came very specifically when I was 27 years old and moved to Vancouver. I can remember it distinctly. And then the importance of the present moment really struck home when I went into my psychosis at age 30, but I never really started living like that until a few years later, and that period sort of went from 33 up until now. And at every step along this journey, something very interesting has been happening. Because once we've become comfortable with one level of consciousness, we start to address our fears and let in the experiences of the next level above. And in this process, the defensive, closed ego dissolves, but only one layer at a time. And as a layer of ego dies, it allows your true self or soul to experience a broader reality and to express itself in that reality in a more authentic, honest way. Now, in real life, an ego death can have you asking questions about yourself like, who am I? What is the real world? Who do I care about? And where do I fit into all this? It can be a period that can be quite confusing for people sometimes. But it can also be very energizing, because when you have a leap in consciousness in your life, you start to see the world in a completely fresh way, and things start to look new and interesting and exciting all over again. And they should, because you've opened yourself up to a whole new level of reality. And with that, you've overcome a tremendous number of fears along the way. Just to give one example from each level of consciousness, we need to remember that when you're at the tribal level, the whole point of living is to honor the spirits and the ancestors. So to move forward to the feudal level, you've got to break through your fear of these spirits and ancestors and fear that they may even kill you. At the feudal level, a big part of living is to demand respect.
So to actually conform to a culture and obey their rules means that you need to start trusting people that otherwise you used to be afraid of. Now, at the traditional level of consciousness, the main thing is to obey the rules and conform to society. So when you start to go against society, there can be a big fear of being punished, especially by God. Now, at the modern level, everything is about achieving success. So when you actually leave that level, the biggest fear you have is a fear of failure. Now, at the postmodern level, everything is about creating harmony and understanding, especially through considering other perspectives and listening to people. So to actually take a stand or have an opinion that you're going to come out and say is better than that of others, well, there you've got to face a big social disapproval, which is what I face every time I talk about spiral dynamics. And then at the Power of Now level, you have a deeper understanding of the importance of keeping your attention in the present moment and a knowledge that if you can do that, that your life is open to love and free of fear. So by now I think it's safe to say that the journey of life can be a very difficult one where we have many fears to face as we grow and develop our level of consciousness and many ego deaths to go through in our lifetime. In fact, I'd describe this journey as positively heroic. And that's exactly how Joseph Campbell described it in his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Because the journey of life for everyone is one in which we need to face our fears and open ourselves up to love. Now, what does all of this have to do with bipolar disorder? Well, to start with, bipolar disorder is a process which is basically putting your spiritual evolution into overdrive. Because especially once you go into an acute psychosis, it's the opportunity for you to completely express the love that is in your heart, to speak your truth, and to face and embrace the fears that are within you. And if you can do that, then a spiritual evolutionary leap in consciousness is not that far away. In part 1 of this series on the spiritual evolution of bipolar disorder, I demonstrated how, as a society and as individuals, we are spiritually evolving from lower levels of consciousness to higher levels through a gradual stage-like dissolving of the layers of our ego, or false self. And through this process, as our egos die one layer at a time, our souls are able to experience more of the real world and express themselves in a more authentic way, moving gradually from a more fearful, closed state to a more open, loving state. And now in this video, I want to provide a little bit more hard evidence of how this evolution is happening. And as you'll see, the evolution of our consciousness has a lot to do with the perspective, or should I say perspectives, from which we can see the world around us. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Now I'm going to deal with the tribal level of consciousness a little bit later because it's a very complex subject. However, at the feudal level of consciousness, we still only have one perspective on life, and that is our own. And at this level, who we are is clearly our body, and basically our 5 senses are telling us what's the real world around us. And because this level is largely unfiltered by the mind, our response to this world is quite impulsive and selfish. And the reason is, at this level, we're simply incapable of taking in the perspectives of other people and considering those in our decision-making process. Basically, whatever we want, that's it. That's the reality. Now, if you're 4 or 5 years old at the feudal level of consciousness, maybe people might think of you as a little bossy, but it's expected for your age and can even be kind of cute. But if you're still at this level going into your 20s, you've got a lot of problems. Your selfish and impulsive desires to do whatever you want without consideration for others could have you ending up in jail or dealing drugs or involved with some other criminal element. Now, unfortunately, in our world today, there still are cultures that are like this in different parts of the world, and a good example is the slums of Rio de Janeiro, which are basically controlled entirely by drug dealers. The local police are very corrupt, and many of the women are involved in prostitution. And in fact, anywhere in the world where you have very high levels of unemployment, extreme poverty, very low levels of education, in this sort of environment, you're going to have a lot of people at the feudal level of consciousness. When we move to the traditional level, we go from having only one perspective on life, which is our own, to taking on a second perspective, the perspective of the culture we're living in.
And with this second perspective, we start to see the world in terms of good and bad, or even good and evil. And what we learn in this duality is that basically what our parents, schools, and religions expect from us, that's considered the good, and we try and conform to that. And as for ourselves, we look at our own impulsive nature and see that as the evil or bad thing. And so, for better or for worse, we'll start to repress our inner nature in order to gain love and social approval. So needless to say, there's a fair amount of repression that happens at this level, but it's not all bad. These days, repression gets a bad rap, but when you're moving from the feudal level of consciousness, the repression of your selfish ways is a needed thing. And throughout history, it's been religion that's helped people find the straight and narrow for the most part, because people at the feudal level usually can't do it on their own. They need strong leadership and structure to help them become better people. Now, traditional culture is pretty easy to find in America today. Just go to any small town, particularly in the Bible Belt, and you're going to find a way of life that really reflects this two-perspective way of thinking. At the modern level of consciousness, we take on a third perspective, and that perspective is of the rational mind. At this point, we're no longer satisfied just obeying certain rules because they're written down in a book. We want to start actually looking at the facts of a situation. So for many people entering the modern level of consciousness, they find their religion quite difficult to deal with. For example, they might start to question creation stories like the world starting with Adam and Eve. Or they might have even deeper rational questions like, if they're going to heaven because they're Christians, what does that say about the billions of people in the world that are not Christian? And then there's the biggest question of all, does God even exist? And for the modern mind, if you're going to argue the existence of God, you better have your facts straight. And then along with all the rational questions that religions are unable to answer, there's also the problem of the conformity as well. For many modern people, strong rituals like needing to pray every day or even 5 times a day, having to be at church every Sunday or Saturday, or even things like no sex before marriage can just seem too restrictive and too conformist for their liking. And as a result, it's not uncommon for many modern people to walk away from the religions or even become atheists or agnostics. And I think the best example of a modern level of consciousness can be seen in New York City, where people are not praying to God for success, but actually getting out and working their butts off to get it. Now, once you move through the modern mind, something remarkable happens, because basically what you start to see is that no matter how hard you work, no matter how successful you become, there's still a certain emptiness inside of you. Because you see, all along this journey of life, you're being told that your happiness, your satisfaction is just up ahead, and yet it never quite arrives. And it's at this point that many people start to ask themselves, what is the meaning of my life? What is the purpose of my life? And why am I here? And so while the rational mind does get rid of the irrational beliefs of the lower levels of consciousness, it also starts to come to the logical conclusion that rationally, life is completely meaningless. And there's something about that answer that simply just doesn't compute. And so in growing exhausted of the cold rationality of the modern mind, a person awakens to the multiple perspective view of the postmodern mind, especially because until now you've had the assumption that there is a certain fixed reality out there that you're responding to. But all of a sudden now you're even starting to question the nature of reality and the nature of who you are as a human being. For the postmodern level of consciousness, there is no one truth out there like the rational mind believes, or the religious mind believes, or even the impulsive feudal mind believes, that there are many truths for many different people, and it's impossible for any one person to say who's right and who owns the entire truth. Now, with this passion for diversity, from a spiritual standpoint, it's at the postmodern level that people really start to explore different ways of approaching spirituality and religion. And as a result, there's a lot of what has been referred to as the New Age movement in this postmodern level of consciousness. And that movement has taken a lot of criticism because it seems to encompass all kinds of different belief systems. But that's what to be expected at the postmodern level, because the postmodern level is so open, it really doesn't discriminate at all against one style of thinking or another, provided that that style of thinking is not exclusive. And that's why in the 1990s you really saw a surge in interest in things like Eastern spirituality, Hinduism, and Buddhism. You saw a boom in tarot cards and tarot card readings, psychics of all kinds, as well as an explosion in self-help books and spiritual books like the Celestine Prophecy, which was #1 on the New York Times list for an entire year. And of course, let's not forget the quantum physics, which had everybody asking themselves, what the fuck do we know? And maybe that should be the mantra for the postmodern level of consciousness, because at this level, your focus is on taking in different perspectives and trying to come to a mutual understanding. And as a result, sometimes it's a quite confusing level to be at, and especially in the world of work, it can take a very long time to make a set decision, because who am I to say if my opinion is better than yours? Now, as you go through the postmodern level of consciousness, you start to realize a few blind spots to this level. The first being that this level is very complicated because you're always looking at different perspectives. And out of this, you start to realize that you need to develop something within you to help you decide amongst different opinions which is the best way to go. And that thing you need to develop, we call our intuition. Now keep in mind, this doesn't mean closing your eyes to alternate perspectives. It just means being able to intuitively choose which is the better perspective to go with depending on the situation. It also means learning to trust your feelings, because the intuitive voice is not coming from the mind. It's coming from your soul. And you can only hear the voice of your soul when you're in the present moment. Now, if you haven't figured it out by now, being in the present moment means being in an open state, a state of love. Anytime we're in a state of love, we're in the present moment. Anytime we're in the present moment, we're in a state of love. And so in truth, at every level of consciousness, there's been moments where we have been at the power of now level, at this higher state of awareness. The trouble is, we just never realized it. That's because the other levels of consciousness had a different underlying focus, which was staying alive. But here the focus shifts from staying alive to being alive. And that makes all the difference. Now, before I get to any conclusions on the spiritual evolution of bipolar disorder, we need to take a look at the tribal level of consciousness, and in particular, the role of shamanism. Because as you'll see, if you want to understand the bipolar mind, first you need to understand the shamanic mind. In the last 100 years, we've really come a long way with regards to our cultural understanding of people different from ourselves, especially with respect to tribal people. In fact, even that term, tribal people, would have been quite unheard of back then. Instead, they would have referred to them just as savages. And far from considering them equal as human beings, civilized society, or so-called civilized society, used to look at them almost like animals. Take Ota Benga, for example. He was an African pygmy who was purchased in Africa to come and be part of an exhibit at the St. Louis World's Fair around the turn of the century. And once the World's Fair was over, he went on to live among the animals at the Bronx Zoo, for a while living in one of the cages. And at the World's Fairs, it wasn't just Africans on display, but tribal people from around the world, including Native American Indians. So needless to say, we've come a long way since 100 years ago, and I think we can largely thank technology, especially television, for that. TV shows from the 50s like The Lone Ranger showed that Indians and cowboys can even be friends, provided the Indians have a decent haircut. And then in the 1990s, race relations took a more intimate turn with movies like Dances with Wolves, where Kevin Costner, playing an American soldier, actually starts to learn from the Indians, learning their ways instead of trying to teach them the more modern ways of the white man. And in my opinion, it was movies like Dances with Wolves that really touched people that were moving into the postmodern level of consciousness. Because it certainly seemed that tribal peoples around the world knew something about living on this planet that modern man had clearly forgotten. Tribal living seemed to create a community that really cared about each other and was there for each other, as opposed to the modern workaholic lifestyle, which has very little time for family and even less for community.
Tribal living had a deep respect for nature and featured almost no environmental damage, especially when compared to modern society. And then maybe most importantly, as opposed to living in an apparently meaningless world where the whole point of living is just to buy more stuff, the tribal society had an intimate relationship with spirit, which was represented best by the tribal shaman. And as a result, small shamanic groups started popping up all over the world, and in fact I belong to one down here in São Paulo, Brazil. Once every couple of months, my wife and I participate in a sweat lodge down here, and then once or twice a year we participate in the Indian dances as well. And these dances aren't easy. The sun-moon dance involves dancing on and off for 3 days without food or water. So, obviously, tribal shamanism plays a pretty important role in my life and my spirituality. However, I still agree with Ken Wilber and the theory of spiral dynamics that the tribal level of consciousness is at the bottom, or should I say the beginning, of the development of our consciousness on this planet. And not only does tribal consciousness represent the very beginning of our development as humans, but it also shares many similarities with the beginning of our own individual consciousness when we're small children. And because of this connection to our own personal childhoods, I wanted to take a very close look at tribal consciousness to show you how far you've evolved in your own life. Okay, so now before I really get into it, let me just clarify that when I'm talking about tribal peoples at the tribal level of consciousness, I'm talking about tribes that have had very limited contact with other cultures, if any. They have no written language, they have no technology, and for the most part they're living in the same way they have for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And when we get a good look at people living on the planet today like that, what we see are people living in a very closed and very fearful state of mind. A way of thinking that often has brutal consequences. Let me give you a few examples. Infanticide, or the killing of children, especially babies, has been very common for thousands of years in tribes around the world, particularly when the babies have a birth defect, and to a certain degree that makes rational sense because it's very difficult for a tribe to maintain a disabled person within the tribe. However, what few people understand is that many children are also killed because it's thought by other people in the tribe that they're possessed by a demon or a bad spirit. You can see how this is done in the video Hakani, which admittedly was made by Christian missionaries, and what the video shows is that when it's thought that a child is possessed by a bad spirit, they will kill the child by burying them alive. And the reason the child is buried alive is because it's believed that the child needs to be killed with his last breath taken under the ground, or else the spirit of the child will come back and haunt the tribe. Another horrific practice is that of female circumcision. In many tribes across North Africa, it's commonly practiced that young girls, as they become women, will have their clitoris cut off. And as explained by a tribal elder in a YouTube video that I have linked here, if they do not perform the female circumcision, the entire tribe will die because they will have disrespected the spirits. Sometimes it's easy to forget that cannibalism was once practiced by many tribes all around the world. The practice was so common in the Fijian Islands that they used to be referred to as the Cannibal Islands. Now, I'm sure that most of you think that thankfully cannibalism has been wiped off the planet Earth. However, in some small tribes in the mountains of New Guinea, occasionally they still eat each other. And when does the tribe eat somebody? When that person has been accused of practicing witchcraft. Now, I chose these 3 examples to demonstrate a couple of things. First, the tribal level of consciousness can be extremely violent, but even more importantly for our discussion on consciousness, there is a great fear that these people have of evil spirits, a fear so great that tribal people around the world will even kill and mutilate people in their own tribe to keep those evil spirits away. So then the big question is, why are tribal people so concerned with evil spirits? Well, the reason is they see the world in a completely different way than does the modern mind. Because for most of us, we just take it for granted that we're living in 2 worlds essentially at the same time. We have our inner world of our mind, where our thoughts, feelings, dreams, fantasies, and memories are. And then we have the outer world that we detect with our 5 senses, where we recognize people, places, and things. However, what few of us realize is that when we're born, our perception is not like this at all. For the small child and for the primitive tribal person, there is only one world. And what I mean is they don't recognize a difference between their inner world and their outer world.
The inner and outer are one. However, this fusion is hardly the cosmic oneness of enlightenment, far from it. Unable to distinguish the thoughts of the imagination from the real world, the small child or the tribal person will engage in entirely irrational, magical thinking. And as a result, their fantasies, but also their fears, become as real as anything happening in the outside world. And this is where the danger lies, because magical thinking brings your fears to life. And a great example of this in daily life is the childhood fear of the dark. And of course, for the tribe, the example of the fearful magical thinking is what we've just talked about, this preoccupation with evil spirits and witchcraft. Now, along with possessing the magical thinking that our children have today, the tribal level of consciousness also thinks in very concrete or literal ways. So in the same way that many children believe that Santa Claus is alive and well and living at the North Pole, the original tribal Hopi Indians believed that the spirits of their Kachina dolls lived on the San Francisco peaks near their tribal land in Arizona. Tribal creation stories, very similar to the ones like the story of Adam and Eve, are always taken as historical fact, never symbolically. And as one final example of very magical concrete thinking, we have the shamanic shape-shifting. During the practice of shape-shifting, the shaman believes that he is actually taking on the physical form of one of his power animals. And in that form, he's able to do things that can help the tribe in some way. And so along with this irrational, magical, concrete thinking, which fuses the inner world and the outer world, for the tribal level there is also a fusion between my inner being and your inner being, or the inner being of the rest of the tribe. As a result, tribal living is a highly structured society with very little, if any, individuality. It's as if the individual in the tribe has no idea who they are outside of what the tribe tells them. So just to sum up so far, I think I've made a pretty strong argument for why the tribal level of consciousness is where we start on this journey called life. Tribal consciousness is fearful, irrational, magical. It's marked by concrete concepts, never symbolic. It has no sense of individuality, and as a result it can be very violent, and it's also pre-literate. And in these ways, the consciousness of tribal society is not a whole lot different than the consciousness of a small child. However, even though it does represent a lower level of consciousness, there are some valuable aspects to tribal consciousness that we've lost in our development that we need to get back in order to move forward as a human species. And this is especially true if you're looking to heal your bipolar disorder, because in my opinion, the best approach towards healing is much more along the shamanic path than it is along the path of either mainstream psychiatry or even mainstream psychology. And so it's on the valuable gifts of the tribal level of consciousness that I'm going to be focusing in part 2 of this video, which you can click on right here. In the first part of this video, I really focused on how the tribal level of consciousness is where we get started in this journey called life. And to prove my point, I gave a number of examples of how tribal people think that I think most of us are glad we've outgrown. However, even though the tribal level represents a lower level of consciousness, at this point in our history, being a modern society, there are also a number of characteristics of tribal life that we can learn from today. However, as I'll show in this video, what we want to do when we learn from tribal peoples is not go back in time to the way they used to live. Nobody wants that. But rather what we want to do is take what was great about these cultures and integrate them into our way of living so that we can grow. And in my opinion, above all else, what we truly need to understand from tribal culture is that spirit is truly everywhere. As tribal people believed, every moment of our lives is a spiritual experience, and every choice we make or action we take has a spiritual dimension and spiritual consequences. But how many of us are actually thinking of the spiritual dimension of life, for example, when we're at work, lying to our clients, or hiding losses? I wonder what the spiritual implications are going to be in families where the parents don't spend any time with their kids. 27 million Americans, that's 1 in 10, are currently on antidepressants, and that doesn't include all the people on illegal drugs. To me, this is just a sign that on a spirit level, people in today's world are really suffering. And for the most part, they're trying to relieve their suffering in entirely the wrong way, often through addiction. So while it's true that our modern world has brought us many technological wonders and a great degree of individual freedom, our overdependence on purely rational materialist thinking has led our culture into a type of wasteland, or as Ken Wilber calls it, the flatland, a purely rational and meaningless world, which feels flat because it has no depth to it. And it's right at this point in our desperate thirst for meaning in life that we can start to look to the tribal cultures for inspiration. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to follow a strict series of superstitious beliefs in order to keep from being punished by the spirits. No, this time around, rather than trying to please the spirits out there, we're trying to follow and satisfy our own inner spirit. You see, at every level of consciousness, the intuition of our inner spirit is communicating to us from the other side. However, as the rational mind develops, it starts to block out the other side, treating it as if it doesn't exist. And in doing so, the rational mind does its job of blocking out the irrational beliefs that are not helpful, but it also blocks out the irrational intuition that can help us guide our lives. Now, the reason I call it irrational is because it's actually superior to rational thought. The rational mind will always lead you to the safe, comfortable, predictable, and logical solution that everyone would expect. But the irrational, intuitive voice of your inner spirit will lead you to make the life choices that make you feel alive, giving life the meaning you're looking for. Now, in the same way that our education system helps us to develop our rational mind, getting in touch with your inner spirit takes a little bit of work as well. But this time, it's your shamanic skills that need developing. And this is especially true if you've got bipolar disorder, because there's nothing like a manic episode or a depression to let you know that your inner spirit is unhappy with how you're living your life. And so now I'd like to give you a few tips on how to develop the shamanic side of yourself. So the first thing you might want to do is start paying more attention to your dreams. As I mentioned earlier, the other side, our dream world, was considered as real to tribal people as this world is to us. However, for the most part in our modern world, we're taught to ignore our dreams. Now, while I'll be the first to admit that sometimes our dreams just seem like total nonsense, if you pay a little bit more attention, you can see that some dreams that you have may be deeply meaningful for your life and help to point you in the right direction. It was a single dream that inspired me to go to Peru, where I met my wife, and then more dreams that inspired me to leave my country of Canada to move to her country of Brazil. Now, sometimes the message of the dream might be obvious. For example, if you have a dream that you're killing your boss, it might be a sign that it's time to quit your job. At other points, the meanings of the dreams may seem more mysterious and symbolic, like the recurring dream I used to have that I was being chased by a tiger. Eventually, I figured out that this tiger represented my inner spirit and that I was ignoring it. That's why the tiger was chasing me. And looking back, I can honestly say that it has been in following my inner spirit and ignoring my rational mind that I've made some of the most important and interesting choices of my entire life. Now, if you're interested in taking a deeper look at your dreams, I also highly recommend meditating, especially before you go to bed. A short meditation of just 15 or 20 minutes can help to make your dream world more vivid, meaningful, and alive. And as you get more practice, you might even want to try lucid dreaming, where you're able to become conscious in your own dream, controlling the elements in the dream while you're there. And one other aspect of our dream world that few people realize is that this dream world stays with us while we're awake. And even though the rational mind is dominating our daily life and we're obsessed with the sensory world around us, all we need to do is close our eyes and we'll find that our dream world is there and it will respond to us. And in fact, many therapists and shamanic healers today take advantage of this ability of ours in visualization exercises, where we consciously interact with the materials of our dream world while we're still awake. Now, the next lesson from tribal shamans all around the world isn't one that modern people like to remember too often. In fact, they like to avoid this lesson at all costs. And that lesson is the value of suffering. Let's face it, it's a tough world out there, and it's always been a tough world. And in fact, the world has never been tougher than when you're living in tribal society. But what these people understood was that it was in overcoming their suffering and enduring their pain that they actually grew in strength and even purified their souls. And as a result, many of the rituals performed by tribes around the world are often extremely painful. Take that sun-moon dance I was talking about in the first video. Now, like I said before, 3 days, no food, no water. It's not an easy ritual to go through. But having done this dance 4 times, I can tell you that it's precisely because of the intensity of the suffering that it's the most powerful ritual that I've ever been a part of. Now, does this mean that I'm recommending that everybody go out and starve themselves to death, tattoo your face, and stick pins through your chest? No. But I am hoping that the kind of courage tribal people show when they go into their rituals will inspire you to face the pain and suffering of your daily life. Because what you're going through in your daily reality is just as important on a spiritual level as what you would endure in any tribal ritual, and often takes just as much courage. Now, if you're bipolar, it's going to be this last lesson that's really the most important, but as you'll see, it really incorporates the teachings from the other lessons as well. And that lesson is that when it comes to healing your bipolar disorder, you need to learn how to swim. You see, it's been well documented that many shamans become shamans after experiences of being plunged into the other side, or what psychiatry would call an acute psychosis. But of course, the big difference is that while the psychosis is blocked by psychiatry, the shaman learns to swim there. That's where he gets his power. And just like the shaman, when we have bipolar disorder and these experiences basically take us over, rather than running from them and blocking them like modern society wants us to do, we need to start embracing and engaging these experiences, just as if we're swimming on the other side, just like a shaman. So just to give an example, when you're in a psychosis, you might feel like you're a bear, or you want to act like a bear, and you don't even know why. Well, according to psychiatry, you would block that experience with medication. But following the shamanic path, you're going to want to let that bear come out. You're going to want to let yourself roar, or even just move around the house like a bear, provided that you're not hurting yourself or anyone else. And this is how we heal the disorder. We get in touch with those feelings or energies that are coming from the other side, and we want to be them. We want to express them in the way that they want to be expressed. So whether you feel like a warrior from a past life, or a baby being born again, if you feel like you're traveling through space, or you've become the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, you need to be able to express these things in order to sort of move through the process. However, as opposed to the tribal shaman, who is going to see the world from his magical perspective, interpreting these experiences in concrete, literal terms, eventually when you heal your bipolar disorder, you need to be able to look back on your experiences and see them as spiritually meaningful, emotionally meaningful, and deeply symbolic, but not as the physical, literal experience that you seem to be having at the time. It's the difference between knowing that you accessed your bear energy and thinking that you were an actual physical bear. Or perhaps more importantly, it's the difference between knowing that you had accessed your Christ consciousness and thinking that you are still Jesus Christ, the Messiah here to save the earth. And in this way, it could very well be your ability to interpret your experiences symbolically and not concretely that could make the difference between you healing from your bipolar disorder and being stuck in a mental hospital. So if you're looking to evolve out of your bipolar disorder, I highly recommend taking a closer look at shamanism, because at the end of the day, the only person that's going to be able to heal you is the shaman that lies within, your own inner healing shaman. According to psychiatry, one of the strongest signs that you've got bipolar disorder is when you start having delusions. And for them, any delusion is caused by a chemical imbalance, which will most likely need medication for your entire life. However, when you take a close look at the type of delusions that people have, many of them, which are very, very common among bipolar people, are often very spiritual in nature. Now, I've already introduced a few of these so-called delusions in the video Is Bipolar Mania Spiritual Enlightenment? So what I wanted to do in this video was just let you in on what I think are the roots of some of these delusions and why they're so common. And as you'll see, in my opinion, most of the so-called delusions are hardly the random connections of a broken brain, but come out of the complex relationship between your soul and your ego. Probably the most common delusion for people entering into psychosis for the very first time is to think that they are either dead or dying. And they should, because in a very real way, they are. You see, as I mentioned in the first video in this series, The Real Cause of Bipolar Disorder, the cause of an acute psychosis will always be the collapse of your ego, or false self. But what I didn't talk about is simply what it feels like when this false self or ego collapse occurs. First, you feel totally different, completely unlike the self you have come to know your entire life. And a part of that self has been your false self, which is made up of all the thoughts and ideas that you have known yourself to be. That's the ego part of you. So then during the ego collapse, when all of this false self just seems to leave you on what I can best describe as an energetic level, you feel so unlike you've ever felt that it's easy to assume, as I did, that you're in fact dead or dying. And in a way, a part of you is. If your psychosis completes itself in a healthy way, much of your false self or ego will die, and what you'll be left with is a feeling that you are much lighter and less boxed in than you were before. After thinking that you're dead or dying, thinking that you're Jesus or some type of Messiah is probably the second most common delusion. Now, why would so many people think that? Well, don't forget that when the ego or false self collapses, what you're left with is your true self or soul. You see, when our ego is in control of things, we have this inner feeling that somehow we're not good enough, that somehow we need to better ourselves in order to justify our existence. And to do that, we need to be something that we're not. And this is the ambition of the ego, our false self, to build ourself up in almost like an artificial way. Then, when that ego drops, how do we feel? We feel perfect, limitless, sacred. So in a sense, we're actually trading one delusion, the delusion of the ego that actually we suck, for something that's quite the opposite. And so engulfed in this feeling of perfection and sacredness, and without the rational egoic mind there to tell us otherwise, it's very easy to jump to the conclusion that we have become Jesus, our culture's strongest symbol of sacredness and perfection. And now it's true not everybody thinks of themselves as Jesus. People from other religious traditions or cultural backgrounds often identify with another religious figure. For example, people of the Islamic tradition might identify with Muhammad or see themselves as another prophet. But this idea of being the Messiah is by far the strongest image. And for women, if they don't see themselves as the Messiah or Jesus, they'll see themselves as actually giving birth to the Messiah, being the mother of Jesus or the Messiah. The third delusion is that we're somehow all-knowing. One sensation that most of us have in our everyday reality is that we never quite seem to know enough. Have you ever noticed that? It's as if no matter what we do, we just can't figure life out without more information. However, once again, when that ego collapses, we're left with this emotional intuition of the soul, which is telling us that everything is as it should be. And in that moment, there's the sensation of completeness. And with that completeness comes this sense of a perfect knowledge, a sense that you know everything there is to know, and yet somehow you can't explain it in words. It's as if you're having one giant nuclear aha moment. And so, considering that you feel that you're a sacred Messiah and have this perfect all-knowing information, what's to do? Save the world, of course. At this point, many people seem to become obsessed with certain social issues like homelessness, poverty, the greenhouse effect, this sort of thing. And then others, including Dr. David Lukoff, felt the compulsion to write their own religious text. The Jim Carrey movie The Truman Show is probably the most common reference that I've heard when asking people what psychosis is like. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise, because once the ego collapses, not only do our senses become more alive, but we also become more sensitive to other people, better able to read how they're feeling. And among the first things that you'll notice while you're in psychosis about the so-called normal people around you is that to some extent, pretty much everybody is acting, meaning that they're all hiding their true emotions, trying their best to fit into the role that they've sought out in society. And so seeing the world in this way, it's very easy to start to believe that you're in a movie, especially one like The Truman Show, where everybody is obviously fake and acting. And yet for many people at the same time, there's also the sensation that everything is just perfect, just the way it is, the psychiatrist, the hospital. Many people in mania head for the psychiatric hospital willingly, thinking, I'll be perfectly fine. It's all part of God's plan, and everything is happening and unfolding as it's meant to happen. And in this way, the sense of being in a movie is not a whole lot different than what was written about life thousands of years ago in the ancient Hindu scripts of India, the Vedas, where it is written that life is a divine play. Number 6 is seeing people as angels or demons. Now, even though the experience can be very sacred, it can also be very confusing, and often we're not sure of what to do next, and we're very often looking for help. But when we start looking for help, we're not looking for the person in charge or the name tag of somebody. No, we're looking for people who are going to love us. And to figure that out, we're going to look a person straight in the eyes. And if their face is open and we see love in those eyes, then we will see an angel before us. However, if that person looks at us judgmentally, analyzing, trying to control and manipulating us, invalidating this sacred experience, then we see a demon and we want nothing to do with them. To me, the most remarkable delusion people have is the sense that they're being tested by God. And with everybody, the test is remarkably the same. Are you going to continue to live on this material plane of reality, or are you going to choose a higher spiritual dimension of existence? And in that choice, maybe you're just saving yourself, but in some situations, some people feel that in making that decision, they're saving their family or even the entire planet. And in making that choice, in order to choose the higher dimension, it will feel like a form of ritualized suicide to the person, but not really in the sense of wanting to end your life and end the pain of existence, but rather in sacrificing your life for the greater good, much like Jesus allowed himself to be crucified rather than trying to escape. Now, some of these attempts appear quite subtle to the point of being absurd, but others can be quite dangerous, which reemphasizes my point that if you're going to try and go through a psychosis, that two people should be supporting and protecting you at all times. For me, it was simply switching off a hotel light switch, which was going to bring my personal annihilation. For my niece, it meant trying to jump through our apartment window. And then there was one guy I know who tried to take everybody on the airplane that he was flying in into the higher spiritual dimension by flushing the toilet in the airplane bathroom. And as crazy as these actions sound, not one of us is medicated today. So looked at this way, is it any wonder that life begins to look like a dream? Is it any wonder that we start to test reality? Because when we're in an acute psychosis, we are Alice, and we have gone way down the rabbit hole. So to sum up, rather than being caused by the chemical imbalance of a malfunctioning brain, all of these so-called delusions represent your reality from your non-ordinary state of consciousness, and in that sense, they're not delusions at all. In fact, I see them as the birth of something quite profound, the awakening of our Christ consciousness. And as with any birth, this process can be quite messy and difficult as well. Once the ego comes back online, some people are quite frightened and terrified of what just happened to them. Others feel even more alienated in this world and have a deep desire to go back to the other side. And then others are simply unable to let go of the experience, having what's normally called delusions of grandeur. Here, people don't remember their experience symbolically as the awakening to their own Christ consciousness. No, with delusions of grandeur, people see their experience concretely, that they are the Christ and superior to all others. However, it's my belief that, again, with loving support and a little guidance, people with these delusions can gradually understand that the true power of the awakening of their Christ consciousness comes when you're able to recognize the Christ consciousness in others and truly connect with other people in a more open and loving way. And when that happens, the spiritual evolution of someone with bipolar disorder becomes the spiritual evolution of all of us. And special thanks to my friends at newlightbeings.com for sharing their stories with me so that I could put this video together. In my last video, I talked about how when bipolar people are in a state of acute psychosis, they can have very spiritual experiences, sometimes even thinking that they're Jesus. However, experiences during acute psychosis can also be quite terrifying. But what's interesting is that even these terrifying experiences can have a spiritual dimension because in some way people have the feeling that the devil is after them. Sometimes people see devils and feel like they're being chased by them. Other people feel like somehow that they're possessed and the devil is inside them. At certain points, some people actually feel like they are the devil in the same way that others have felt that they're Jesus. And then other people will have the devil or demons saying terrible things to them, like that they should kill somebody or kill themselves, that they're shit, that they're worthless, things like that. And so along with very loving experiences of good that we can have in psychosis, we can also have the dark side of the spirit world, experiences of evil. And more than any other, it's these dark and disturbing experiences that are the most difficult for people to work through. And they raise a very important point about the theory behind the videos I've presented up to now. You see, so far I've been saying that an acute psychosis starts when we have a collapse of the ego and you're left to experience your own soul. But if what you're experiencing is your own pure soul, where does the evil come from? Well, in truth, it certainly looks like our souls are not entirely pure. As I've mentioned in other videos, during our lifetimes we become traumatized by certain things, and if we don't experience all the feelings of our traumas, then they will stay with us as energies, in a sense contaminating our souls. And on another level, it certainly seems that some of us, if not all of us, have a certain amount of evil born into us when we come into this planet. Now, I know this idea is unpopular with some people, but certainly in Christianity there is the belief that we are born having original sin. That's why we need a baptism. And from Eastern spirituality, they believe that we come into this world from past lives, that we're reincarnated. And so if we look at ourselves that way, it could be possible that we come into this world from a past life carrying this karma or negative energies that are records of the sins we've committed in the past. And so based on what these religions have to say, in addition to what I actually see when people go into an acute psychosis, it certainly seems that we are born with a certain amount of lower or negative energies that we need to work through in this lifetime. And from what I've seen, there's no better place to work through these energies than in an acute psychosis. Because it's in this non-ordinary state of consciousness that these energies really come to the surface. And as I've mentioned in other videos, if you're able to embrace and engage these experiences, then the energies associated with them become released and you become a more purified human being. And this all sounds great except for one thing. When these energies are dark and disturbing and evil, it's very easy to go into a state of denial about what's happening to us. And once we're in denial about our own inner experience, then we start to project it. And once you start projecting, then you're in real trouble. Now, what is projection? Well, basically it's anything that's going on inside of you that you decide is actually happening outside of you, that's going on around you. And the most famous form of projection is paranoia. Paranoia comes in a variety of shapes and sizes, but they all have one thing in common. It always feels like someone or something is out to get you. People think that the CIA or the FBI is after them, or that maybe they're being monitored or even controlled by space aliens, or even the Illuminati, whoever that is. It could be your psychiatrist who's spying on you to make sure you take your medication, or even your friends and family that are conspiring against you. For one homeless guy in my neighborhood, his problem is snakes. He's totally concerned that snakes are going to crawl up his pant legs. Germs can also be a big problem because they're invisible and they exist everywhere. And in many situations, the paranoid person will have the feeling that the groups that are after them, although maybe not the snakes and the germs, will have some sort of surveillance equipment to keep an eye on them as well. Paranoid people can have the sensation that their phones are being tapped when they're really not, or that there's hidden cameras in their homes, or maybe even that someone's put a microchip in their brain in order to control them. Now, where does the paranoia come from? Well, I think Dr. Stan Grof has the best explanation that I've found so far, because he thinks that when the ego collapses, often we find ourselves in this cosmic oneness where there's no boundaries. And in that oneness we can feel connected to everything and it can feel quite good. But the dark side is that if there's no boundaries, then there's also no defenses. And whatever's out there can get in here and get to me and attack us. And I think a great example of this is when people start to have psychic sensations. Once in an acute psychosis, people become extremely sensitive and may even have the feeling that they're becoming psychic, reading other people's thoughts. And while some people might enjoy this newfound sensation, other people can have the reverse feeling that, uh-oh, if I can read other people's thoughts, then maybe they can read my thoughts.
And that's the paranoid part of the whole thing.
Now, as I've said in many videos, I think it's very possible to heal yourself from bipolar disorder and episodes of acute psychosis. However, if somebody is really locked into a series of paranoid thoughts, that healing process becomes extremely difficult. Because the paranoid person is projecting their inner experience and not dealing with it, that means that they're not healing. It's impossible for them to move through the process. Now, while there is the possibility that a very compassionate support team is able to turn the paranoid person around and get them to engage their process, there is also the darker possibility that the paranoid person blames the support team for what's happening to them and refuses their help entirely. In being uncooperative, they might try and escape or run away, and they may even try and attack the support team. And so it's for all of the reasons I just mentioned that someone in a deeply paranoid state will most likely need medication unless they can be turned around quite quickly. Now, this may be a shock to people who followed my work, but what you need to understand is that in a state of paranoia, there's no healing taking place and the person is suffering unnecessarily. And so while it is true that many paranoid people will need medication, I hope that we can use it in the future as a tool and not as a way of life. And what that means is that while the person is being medicated, they're also working to get in touch with the feelings that they were rejecting while they're in psychosis. Because what you normally find is when you meet somebody that's had a very traumatic psychosis, chances are they've also had a very traumatic life. So whether you feel that devils and demons are after you, or you're scared of the teddy bear in your bedroom, in the end, all of these experiences are rooted in the dark and fearful energies that are within ourselves. And while it may be very difficult sometimes, still, the more you're able to work through these energies, the better off you'll be. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, a hallucination is when you see, hear, feel, or smell something which does not exist. And because they don't exist, modern psychiatry views them as the meaningless malfunction of a broken brain, a dangerous occurrence which can and should be stopped with medication. And at first glance, this makes perfect sense, because if you're seeing things that absolutely nobody else can see, well then chances are you've probably got a fairly serious mental illness. At least that's what I thought until I had a few hallucinations of my own. Back in my own bipolar awakening 13 years ago, I was literally wandering through a shopping mall somewhat pointlessly when I started to hear the music The Wanderer playing on the speakers in the mall. Or was that music in my head? To this day, I don't know. And then a few days later, while laying on the carpet in a hotel ballroom, I was staring at a chandelier of white lights, and a light in the middle of the chandelier turned pink. Now that, I'm sure, was a hallucination. But to me, these were hardly the signs of mental illness. I mean, I was wandering through a shopping mall, and then the music playing was The Wanderer. It sort of gave meaning to the whole experience. And then that light turning pink I took clearly as a message from God that part of my bipolar awakening had ended, and that somehow I was receiving a gift of love. Now, what I didn't know back then was that this kind of experience is quite common for bipolar people, having rather subtle, almost friendly hallucinations that seem to be giving you spiritual messages. Sometimes they can be just reassuring, like hearing the voice of God or Jesus, or maybe even a dead relative saying, "I love you." But the messages can also be very unique and specific, like one girl I know heard a group of Vikings singing happy birthday to her, letting her know that she was being reborn. Audible hallucinations, or voices, can also give advice on how to run your life. For example, one girl was told to get her house in order. And then other voices can be very specific and pragmatic, like continue to take your medications for now. That's what one person was told. And another was told to simply go back inside the house because being outside was too dangerous. Visual hallucinations can also provide the same sort of reassuring or counseling messages. And often these messages are carried by spiritual figures like angels, saints, or Jesus. But the messengers can also be quite symbolic as well. While getting a massage, my niece had a hallucination or vision of a conch floating in front of her, and then only later did she find out that the masseuse actually worshipped Iemanjá, the Brazilian goddess of the sea. So, while they may not exist for everybody else, the voices and visions which psychiatry dismisses as mere hallucinations can have meaning for us that we may find truly inspiring. Now, if you'll remember from my last video on paranoia, sometimes hallucinations come with not such a friendly face. And as opposed to being inspiring, often they simply scare the crap out of people. And in fact, especially the audible hallucinations that are most often associated with schizophrenia, the messages can be quite destructive, telling people that they should kill themselves or maybe kill other people like their parents. Another usually disturbing type of hallucination is when somebody sees the face of one person transform or morph into the face of someone else. And it's when I first came across this morphing phenomenon that I started to understand the meaning of these disturbing hallucinations. Because one guy we were working with last year started to see the face of his dead ex-girlfriend who had committed suicide in the face of his current girlfriend. Then later, in the depths of his bipolar psychosis, he was having extended conversations with the spirit of this girl, telling her that it was time for her to leave him. And that's when I began to realize that disturbing hallucinations were often connected to traumatic experiences. Basically, when we have an unresolved traumatic issue, this issue will stay with us in our body as a kind of trapped energy. Eckhart Tolle has referred to this as the pain body. Now, every single one of us is carrying around some level of trapped traumatic energy in this pain body of ours. However, if the healing and releasing of this trauma is absolutely critical to the health of your soul, then the traumatic energy will create a hallucination, usually in the form of a voice or an image, that will force you to recognize its existence. And in this way, a hallucination can be seen as simply a strong dream of the utmost importance. It's a message of your soul that demands to be heard. And so if it demands to be heard, why does it appear to be scary or evil? Well, just like a dream that turns into a nightmare, this image is a manifestation of your own fear. And the more fearful you are of re-experiencing any particular trauma in your life, the scarier the hallucination will be. Dr. John Weir Perry was the first psychiatrist I came across which described the connection between buried trauma and hallucinations. R.D. Laing linked schizophrenia to childhood trauma back in the 1960s. And more recently, Dr. Rufus May, a former schizophrenic himself, has become somewhat famous through the documentary The Doctor Who Hears Voices, championing the idea that through therapy, audible hallucinations can be healed if you just pay careful attention to what they have to say. And although I hadn't looked into the formal research, from the thousands of messages I've received over the past 2 years, I had come to expect that people who were experiencing strong and fearful hallucinations were very often coming from very difficult family upbringings, often involving physical abuse and or sex abuse. And in fact, some doctors are starting to confirm this hypothesis. In 2006, PsychCentral.com reported that 13 different research studies have verified that between 51% and 97% of people suffering from schizophrenia have been physically or sexually abused. In New Zealand, one study has found that 17 of 22 patients who were abused in childhood had hallucinations, delusions, and or thought disorders, the primary symptoms of schizophrenia. And finally, at nonprofit organization Intervoice, which also believes in listening to the voices of audible hallucinations, they found that 75% of adults and 85% of children had voices which could be directly linked back to specific traumas in their lives. So, rather than looking at hallucinations as meaningless because they're not real, we need to start seeing them as special messengers from our souls. Messengers that are trying to help us heal. Sometimes they speak to us in gentle, reassuring ways, providing inspiration and guidance. Other times they torment us for ignoring our deepest feelings. Either way, if we ever hope to heal, we need to start listening to these messengers, paying close attention to what they have to say. And what can help you do this is to remember, first, the hallucination can never harm you. It's not a physical threat. It's a projection from you that needs to be interpreted symbolically, not concretely. Second, the dark or evil hallucinations are not here to kill the real you, but they may want to kill your ego. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. That's why it requires real courage to engage these spiritual forces. But once you do, then, just like all aspects of psychosis, the key to healing your hallucinations is to surrender to them. So instead of medicating yourself or praying that they're going to go away, you might want to just go to them before they come to you. To do this, you can simply lay down on your bed, get very quiet, and invite them into your life. Then, once you have their attention, you might want to start talking to them. And for one, you could ask them, well, what are you doing here? Remember, these dark energies are only feeding on your fear. So if you can find the courage to simply open yourself up to them, the love which springs from your openness will make them leave. And by the way, if you do find this idea too scary, have someone stay with you for support. It's always easier to do this sort of thing with somebody else's help. Now, for some people, when these energies leave our pain bodies, it can feel like a real exorcism. This is what one of my friends at New Light Beings had to say when her demons left her. I used to see black shadows of monsters everywhere, but when the demons left, so did the visual hallucinations, the worst ones. It felt so pure when they were sucked out of my body. It was like all the filth in the world lived deep down in my soul, and it was forcefully and powerfully sucked out. Everything looked brighter, happier, crystal clear. I was a baby. And finally, if you're looking to develop the courage to deal with your inner demons, you might want to take a look at Dr. Carl Jung's The Red Book. Back when Jung was a practicing psychiatrist, he started to suffer from schizophrenia himself, but instead of turning to psychiatric treatment, he began to write a diary in which he documented the intimate conversations he had with the different entities he would find in his own mind. The book also contains many images that Jung painted in order to help him integrate these buried parts of himself. Although he considered the book his finest work, he never published it, knowing that the world was not ready for what he had to say. However, almost 50 years after his death, the book is finally being published this year and promises to be one of the most influential books of our times. So it certainly seems that when it comes to the spiritual realms of our own soul, the world is finally waking up. Starting in April of 2007, I went out on a mission to answer a simple question. What is the difference between a spiritual awakening and bipolar disorder? And now, finally, after almost 3 years of research, thousands of emails and comments, and 20 consecutive slideshow videos on this subject alone, I can finally share with you my definitive answer. And that answer is that I've been asking the wrong question. However, as you'll see, by figuring out that I was asking the wrong question, I eventually stumbled upon the right one. And with that, I think I've come across an absolute breakthrough with regards to how, as a society, we view both bipolar disorder and spiritual experiences. A breakthrough that could eventually lead to the healing of thousands of people, not only from bipolar disorder, but from schizophrenia and many other mental disorders. So what this video is really about is how I went from asking the wrong question to asking the right one. You see, before I knew anything about bipolar disorder, I had searched for a clinical understanding of my own spiritual awakening shortly after it happened about 10 years ago. It was then that I discovered the work of Dr. Stan Grof, and for Grof there was a condition that looked very much like mental illness, but could actually lead to a spiritual breakthrough, which is what I had, and he called this condition a spiritual emergency. In reading his book, The Stormy Search for the Self, I finally found some validation for my spiritual experience, something that few others were willing to believe, that what I had been through was indeed spiritual and not a mental illness. And in the back of this book, he had an appendix to help people determine the difference between a mental illness like schizophrenia and a true spiritual emergency. So here are some of the criteria for a spiritual emergency. First, exams show no pathology or disease affecting the brain. The intellect and memory are challenged but intact. Adequate pre-episode social functioning and healthy relationships. Enough trust to be able to communicate and cooperate with others during the episode. And conversely, there should be an absence of self-destructive behavior, aggressive behavior, or withdrawal from help. The person in a spiritual emergency could also have the feeling that something important, healing, and even spiritual is happening. Spiritual themes such as birth and death are also present in an experience of spiritual emergency. And so, because my experience met all of Groff's criteria, I went for over a decade thinking that my experience and that of people with mental illness were completely different. However, when my niece Anna had an experience in 2007, I was struck by how similar it was to my own and became convinced that she was having a spiritual emergency, even though her psychiatrist was medicating her for what he saw as a mental illness, most likely bipolar disorder. It was then that I started this research project as well as making YouTube videos to share my story. Once the comments started rolling in, I realized that thousands of people labeled with bipolar disorder had stories similar to my own and fit Groff's criteria for a spiritual emergency. And not only that, but once I started producing theory videos explaining what actually happens to someone when they're in a spiritual emergency, I realized that many of us were going through the same deeply spiritual themes while we were in this apparent insanity. Both a spiritual emergency and bipolar mania can have a feeling of cosmic oneness to it, a feeling of timelessness. You may feel you have all-knowing universal knowledge or a deep sense of sacredness. There can be spiritual visions or voices, or as psychiatrists call them, hallucinations. You may think that you're dreaming or in a movie, that you're being tested by God, that you're the Messiah, a prophet, or a saint, or that you're dead, dying, or being reborn. And these are just a few of the very common spiritual experiences that many bipolar people identified with in my videos. However, some bipolar people did not identify with these experiences at all. Not only did these people hate my videos, but they also hated me for making them. "What is so spiritual about wanting to kill my cats?" one guy asked me. "You're going to have to answer to Jesus for this," said one woman. Apparently, for some people, bipolar mania had been almost an anti-spiritual experience. Some people suffered from very demonic hallucinations. Others endured severe paranoia or deep feelings of anger. For me, these people seemed to be encountering experiences that I'd always considered to be closer to schizophrenia. But perhaps what was most common was not these highly positive spiritual experiences or the deeply fearful, painful experience. No, what was most common was a mixed episode. Most people would experience both ends of the spectrum, the love and the fear, the joy and the pain, the good and the evil. It seemed to me that rather than being a separation between spiritual emergencies and bipolar disorder, there was a spectrum of experiences, from those dominated by love to those dominated by fear, with most people having a type of mixed episode which would lie somewhere in the middle, a mix of love and fear. And not only that, but this spectrum would go from spiritual emergencies to bipolar disorder all the way to schizophrenia, with no definitive break between the three. And so it's in this way that I became convinced that three experiences which I was sure were completely separate from each other were actually all part of the same spectrum of experience. And that's when I realized that my original question was going nowhere, because I was never going to find a clear, distinct line between a spiritual awakening and bipolar disorder. But it was in realizing that I needed to change direction that I went from asking the wrong question to asking the right one. And that question is, if experiences of spiritual emergency, bipolar mania, and schizophrenia are all part of the same spectrum, then what are the key factors which would lead to someone having a more positive, negative, or mixed episode of psychosis? And it's that question that I intend to answer in part 2 of this video, which you can click on right here. Now, as luck would have it, back during the time I was studying Stan Groff's stuff, I was also studying Ken Wilber. And it's with Wilbur that I learned about another type of spectrum, what he called the spectrum of consciousness. And as it turns out, just as people in psychosis have experiences ranging from the very fearful to the very loving, according to Wilbur, we actually evolve from more closed, fearful levels of consciousness to more open, loving levels of consciousness. And so, in recognizing this parallel between the spectrum of psychosis and the spectrum of consciousness, I started to wonder if they would somehow match up. Meaning, would people at a higher, more loving level of consciousness have more spiritual emergency type of psychosis? Would the people at the lower levels have more fearful, schizophrenic type psychosis? And most importantly, would the people in the middle have more mixed episodes, the typical type of bipolar psychosis? Now, in order to see if this theory had any useful value to it, the toughest part for me was going to be determining if schizophrenia was connected to the lowest levels of consciousness. And this was mainly because I didn't have a lot of contact with people who had severe schizophrenia, the type of people who might spend many months or years in psychiatric institutions. However, after a few years of research and a lot of reading, I did find that there are a number of similarities between the way people at lower levels of consciousness think and the way people with schizophrenia think. Now, along with the very fearful life experience that I've already talked about, probably the most obvious and important similarity is that both groups have hallucinations. In fact, there's a very interesting book by a guy named Julian Jaynes called The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And in this book, he explains how people, not only at the tribal level of consciousness, but also at the earliest levels of civilization, people in the feudal level, were not directed by their own mind, but by the commanding visions and voices of the gods. In fact, visions and voices were common in ancient Egypt, Greece, India, and among tribal peoples around the world. Proof of the commonplace nature of these occurrences can be found in the earliest books of the Old Testament, parts of the Greek Iliad, and the Hindu Vedas as well. In fact, hallucinations were so pervasive in these more primitive civilizations that Jaynes writes, according to our theory, we could say that before the second millennium BC, everyone was schizophrenic. And just like with primitive peoples, when someone with schizophrenia has a hallucination, they interpret that vision or voice concretely, never symbolically. So that angel that they see or hear appears to them as real as the hand in front of your face. And because of this concrete way of interpreting reality, when people at these levels have a God experience, it's very common for them to think that they are the exact reincarnation of Jesus Christ, having power over others. Now, I know this may seem highly irrational, but you need to understand that in both groups, reality is seen as an entirely magical place. Because, as I explained in my videos on tribal consciousness, the inner world and the outer world are fused together, making both schizophrenics and tribal people highly superstitious. And so with a mind that works like this, it's no wonder that both groups have a deep fear and respect for evil spirits, devils, and demons. It truly is a mind where any fears that you have are brought to life. So overall, whether someone is at a lower level of consciousness or they're suffering from schizophrenia, we're really seeing someone who's living in their own world, someone who sees the world from one perspective. The movie The Soloist, starring Jamie Foxx and Robert Downey Jr., gives a very honest look at how isolated this one-perspective reality can be. There, Foxx plays a former musician who now lives in a world of shadows and potential threats due to his schizophrenia. And as you'll see, the one-perspective reality makes it very difficult for him to maintain any relationships because it's almost impossible for him to consider other people's thoughts and feelings when he makes decisions or takes action. So, considering all of these similarities, I think it's safe to say that we've got a clear connection between the type of psychosis associated with schizophrenia and the lower levels of consciousness. Now, the question was, would I find a similar relationship at the higher end of the spectrum? Well, to start, the Power of Now level and the Postmodern level are the most open, loving levels of consciousness in the model. These levels also have a much more spiritual but non-religious view of life, which parallels the insistence of many people in spiritual emergencies that they're in fact going through a spiritual experience. These are also the most intuitive levels of consciousness, where people often override their purely rational, logical thinking and trust their intuitive feeling for things instead. And this ties in with the intuitive interpretation that people give when they're having a spiritual emergency. that they're going through something very important, some inexplicable inner process which must be completed. Both groups also see reality as being deeply meaningful on a symbolic level. They will think, wow, this looks like a hotel, but it feels like purgatory. Or he looks like a security guard, but he seems like an angel. As a result, rather than being bombarded with the disturbing concrete thoughts and hallucinations of schizophrenia, people in a spiritual emergency are often quite pleasantly surprised by startling synchronicities, especially receiving messages from the television, music, or other symbolic communications which seem specifically designed for them. But of course, as people at the higher levels of consciousness know, synchronicities aren't just for people that are in experiences of psychosis. Many postmodern spiritual books like the Celestine Prophecy discuss the importance of synchronicities in our daily lives. Global issues such as poverty, the environment, war, or racism could all surface when somebody is in the middle of a spiritual emergency, and these are issues that increase in personal importance as you get into the higher levels of consciousness. And finally, as opposed to the one perspective thinking of schizophrenia, many people in spiritual emergencies are already thinking in a postmodern multiple perspective way of seeing things. To give one example, my favorite stories of so-called psychosis come from former atheists who open up to seeing life from different perspectives once they're hit with a powerful spiritual emergency. So once again, it appears that we have a lot of compelling evidence for connecting the more positive spiritual experiences of a spiritual emergency with the higher levels of consciousness. Okay, so what would connect the middle, traditional, and modern levels of consciousness to the type of psychosis usually diagnosed as bipolar mania? Well, based on my research, I would say that the main characteristic at this level is confusion. Being bipolar is confusing for a couple of reasons. First, like I said, you're most likely having a mixed episode. You're having experiences of love expressed through cosmic oneness, timelessness, and a sense of all-knowingness, just to give a few examples. But on the other hand, it can be very frightening as well, as many people experience moments of paranoia, even hallucinations, and regressions into trauma, which can be quite painful. And then, of course, there's the drugs, which don't help much either. For most people with bipolar disorder, drug experiences, usually with marijuana or LSD, have been a part of what triggered their first episode. So for yourself and others, it may be hard to separate the effects of the drug from the psychosis itself. Another source of confusion is simply the way people think at these levels of consciousness. You see, as we evolve from the magical, concrete lower levels to the symbolic, intuitive higher levels, the middle levels, particularly the modern level, is much more factual and logical. And as a result, any inner experiences we happen to be going through are invalidated, they're denied because they can't be measured. If you're at the modern level, everyone will have you believing that your disorder is caused by a chemical imbalance, even though the scientific evidence will show that you're biologically normal. At the traditional level, people might see you as having a moral flaw, like God is punishing you for something you did. But either way, regardless of how you felt about your experience on the other side, people at these two middle levels of consciousness will work to convince you that these experiences are bad and better off forgotten. And if you're at those middle levels, you'll probably believe them. So once again, we find a lot of compelling evidence demonstrating that a typical bipolar psychosis usually fits within the modern and traditional levels of consciousness, especially because at this stage of development, any spiritual experiences we go through are denied, first by our society, then by ourselves. Schizophrenia, bipolar mania, spiritual emergencies. The spectrum of psychosis matches seamlessly with the spectrum of consciousness. Now, just recognizing this relationship will be a huge step forward for both psychiatry and psychology. But before I explain why, I need to add one more very important factor to our model. A factor that will also help us understand why it's much easier for some people to heal from psychosis than others. And that missing factor is trauma. When diving into the ocean of your own soul, it helps to know what lies beneath the surface. Maybe that water is crystal clear, but maybe it's full of sea monsters. Now either way, it's always a hero's journey. But when you know those waters are especially dark and dangerous, it helps to know what might be in store for you. And that's why having some idea of your own degree of life trauma is especially important before you take the plunge. Now, normally most people think of trauma as related to child abuse, and that is by far the most damaging form of trauma that I've come across. However, as I talked about in my video on trauma, it can come in surprising forms. Experiences from any time in our lives can have a powerful effect on us, such as witnessing a murder or being in a fire. But we can also be affected by traumatic events which we have no conscious memory of, like being an unwanted pregnancy. But regardless of the shape these traumas take, there does seem to be a general rule, which is that the more traumatic your life experience is, the more difficult your experience on the other side will be. You see, once you're into the so-called psychosis, there is a tremendous opportunity to heal the wounds you carry from those experiences in life that you would rather forget, or may have completely forgotten. However, before the healing can take place, there's a catch. And that catch is that you need to re-experience the trauma first. And that's the hard part. You see, as long as that sea monster is swimming in the deep, he's outside of your awareness, even though he's always there. In order to get rid of him, you need to let him come to the surface, where you can see and feel all of his ugliness in the light of day. And it's in this process of allowing our sea monsters, or our traumas, to become completely conscious, emotionally and intellectually, that they finally disappear. Now, the good news in all of this is that during the acute psychosis, it's often possible to rid yourself of painful experiences which may have haunted you for years, and this can happen in just a matter of hours or even minutes. All that needs to take place is that you need to open yourself emotionally to what you're feeling inside. And that can be a scary thing, because some of the energies connected to these traumas can be very powerful. It's not uncommon for people to be crying, screaming, or even blacking out when these experiences happen. And so for many people in this situation, sensing the emotional pain and memories arising within, it's tempting to simply try and block whatever's happening within you. Playing loud music, talking non-stop, or even doubling up on the meds. But for the true healing to take place, you really need to let go. And so because trauma is such an important factor to consider, I've added it to the model here because, as I said, all things being equal, the more trauma that is within you, the more difficult and fearful your process will be. And so that's why on the left I'm connecting heavy trauma with high fear, and on the right, light trauma with low fear. And if you take a look at my video on hallucinations, you'll see that I've already found a relationship between a heavy amount of trauma and schizophrenia. And it should come as no surprise that the people at the opposite end of the spectrum, those having the very positive spiritual experiences, had very few difficult traumas to deal with in their experience of psychosis or in their life history. Now, I'm sure there are many people out there with bipolar disorder that don't consider their lives to be particularly traumatic, and that may be the case. However, there is one other type of trapped energy which we carry within us that needs to surface when you're in a typical manic psychosis, and that is the energy of repressions. You see, as we move from the one perspective reality of the feudal level into the two perspective world of the traditional level, we learn to repress our emotions. Now, as I talked about in a previous video, learning to repress emotions is an important skill as it helps you get along with people better. However, some people become overly repressed, feeling that they can never truly be themselves. That's why I've called bipolar disorder I can't be me disorder. And based on the people I've talked to, I would say that it's the repression of your true self or inner spirit, which is often a big part of why people go into psychosis. So you see, as opposed to someone with very deep psychological problems who's perhaps had a lifetime of difficulties relating to people, many people with bipolar disorder were in fact the opposite. Top of their class, straight-A students, popular and charismatic. It's just that perhaps the expectations they felt they needed to live up to may have become too much for them, or in fact didn't really reflect who they were as a person. So as opposed to being in the more traumatized lower left-hand corner of our chart, most of the people diagnosed with bipolar disorder that I've talked to would find themselves towards the upper right, dealing with some trauma but also a fair amount of emotional repression. Now, some of you might be asking, if people in the far upper right-hand corner are already at a higher level of consciousness and have less trauma or repressions to deal with than others, then why would they enter into a psychosis at all? Well, starting with the modern level of consciousness, we begin to question our own reality. And at first, we challenge the thinking of our culture, questioning our religious beliefs, cultural obligations, or even superstitions that might be left over from the lower levels. But at the postmodern level, we begin to question everything, even our own rational mind. Here, the world somehow opens up, and the sense of wonder we had as children returns, especially as we begin to see how our own thoughts, feelings, and attitudes directly impact or even help create our own reality. And so in order to create a better world for themselves, people become much more introspective at the postmodern level, questioning the limitations of their own consciousness in order for them to improve. As a result, people in or near the postmodern level are often enthusiastically involved in activities which, whether they know it or not, put them on a course for breaking out of their own ego or false self, and possibly into a very positive spiritual psychosis or spiritual emergency. Now, these activities may include intensive self-help seminars, spiritual retreats, reading a very inspiring book could be a trigger, or even foreign travel in the name of finding yourself. Pretty much any highly stimulating, thought-provoking activity could be part of the ego-breaking triggers that takes you into psychosis, including watching videos from Bipolar or Waking Up. Now, are traumas and repressions still a factor here? Sure they are. It's just that for those in the upper right, the psychosis they find themselves in is often caused, quite accidentally, by their own efforts to expand their level of consciousness. And this brings me to another interesting aspect of this model, because based on the people I've talked to, it seems to me that when it comes to the life circumstances or triggers which cause someone to go into their first psychosis, the people in the upper right usually have many triggers happening, while those in the lower left have few, if any. For example, a typical upper right bipolar psychosis involves moving away to university. The combination of a new school in a new city, being away from family and old friends, being introduced to new ideas, and then maybe seeing your grades drop, plus smoking a lot of marijuana, this combination of triggers could initiate a psychosis in just about anybody. On the other hand, someone hallucinating devils at the age of 14 or 15 may not be able to remember any specific triggers causing their first episode. So as opposed to people on the upper right, who usually have many triggers to their first acute psychosis, those on the lower left usually only have one or two, as it's the severity of the trauma that they've been through that is primarily responsible for their first episode. So, it's been a long journey, but a satisfying one, because I think I've finally got a pretty good answer to my question. If you remember from part 1, I started out looking for the difference between a spiritual awakening and bipolar disorder, but then in realizing that there was actually no definitive separation between a spiritual awakening or a spiritual emergency, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, I then asked what are the key factors which would lead to someone having a more positive, negative, or mixed episode of psychosis. And those key factors turned out to be consciousness and trauma. And knowing this, we can start to look at the spectrum of psychosis in a whole new way. You see, it's important to remember that up until now, according to psychiatry, all episodes of acute psychosis should be medicated, and most people become medicated for life. And that even among the most open-minded psychiatrists and psychologists, there's been a genuine frustration in the inability to clearly define a spiritual experience from insanity. However, what our model shows is that there will never be a clear diagnostic criteria to separate one experience from the other. And so rather than looking at these experiences in black and white terms of spiritual or insanity, we can now assess someone's probability of healing based on our model. And what we'll find is that for people approaching the upper right-hand side, there will be a high probability of having healing, even spiritual breakthroughs. Having much more fearful, traumatic experiences, those people in the lower left-hand side of the model will have a lower probability of healing, as it's much more difficult for those people to engage the material that they're confronted with.
And as for people labeled with bipolar disorder, as always, they fall somewhere in the middle, usually having mixed episodes of love and fear. And for these people, their probability of healing can be good, provided that they're given the education and support necessary to help them work through their processes. Because in truth, wherever you would find yourself in this model, every acute psychosis has at least the potential of transforming into a spiritually healing experience.
What exactly does it mean to heal from bipolar disorder? Well, according to our current medical model, to heal from something means two things. First, that you were originally in a healthy, normal state, and then you became sick in an abnormal, unhealthy state. The goal of all medicine is to help you recover from your sickness to your previous normal state, and they usually do this by prescribing medication or performing surgery or both. So from the perspective of modern medicine, and most importantly for us, psychiatry, to heal means to get back to normal. But what exactly is normal? I mean, is this normal? Or this? How about this? Or this? You see, throughout history, our definition of what is normal has changed a lot. And for most of the time, if you are not normal within the cultural boundaries of what normal is, you are considered weird, evil, or even mentally ill. Homosexuality was considered a mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association right up until 1973. And back in the 1850s, if you were a runaway slave, you were diagnosed with the mental illness drapetomania. That was the illness which motivated slaves to want to escape their masters. And according to Dr. Samuel Cartwright, the remedy for drapetomania was whipping the devil out of them.
So, as you can see, what is considered sick and what is considered normal has changed a lot over the years. But the one thing that has not changed is that whatever your illness, getting you back to normal has always been what modern medicine is really all about. But what if healing did not necessarily mean bringing you back to normal? What if healing meant actually bringing you back transformed, not back to the way you once were, but actually to a new condition which is better than you were before? You see, if there's one thing I've learned from studying bipolar disorder, it's that healing is not nearly as much about fixing your mental illness as it is about transforming your previously so-called normal life. You see, because for most people, it's that normal life that gave them the disorder in the first place. It's not so much that being normal is bad, it's just that up until now, every society that has ever existed has operated from a restricted level of consciousness. And because it's your society or culture which dictates what normal is, being normal has always been less than ideal. Let me give you a few examples. Magical thinking, which causes people to think that their rituals or taboos directly affect real-life events, is listed on Wikipedia as a sign of the mental illness schizotypal disorder, and yet tribal people and villagers all around the world think in this way. Children everywhere also suffer from this mental illness of magical thinking because all children begin their development that way. Why do you think they all love Harry Potter? So being limited, both tribal people and children have magical thinking, but also being limited, but to a lesser extent, modern psychiatry sees this form of thinking in adults as a sign of mental illness, when in fact for all peoples at lower levels of consciousness, magical thinking is completely normal. At the traditional level of consciousness, racism and bigotry is completely normal. Unable to see beyond the ego boundaries of their own culture, people at this level look at humans outside of their own group as somehow inferior, untrustworthy, or perhaps evil, and in the process create a great deal of evil themselves. In fact, whenever you find regional conflicts in the world, chances are that racism or bigotry is at the root of the problem.
And so while many postmodern people wish to put an end to racism and bigotry of all kinds, the fact is that these behaviors are normal for people at the traditional level of consciousness. At the modern level of consciousness, people have, for the most part, overcome their magical thinking and their bigotry. However, their perspective on life is still limited, not so much from a closed mind, but more from a closed heart. For modern man, life is about success, which in the workplace means doing whatever it takes to show how well you're performing. As a result, corporate fraud and the lying that goes with it is common at the modern level of consciousness. Enron, Citibank, Kmart, British Petroleum, most if not all of the big pharmaceutical companies, and even Apple have all been found guilty of corporate fraud along with thousands of other companies around the world because at the modern level of consciousness, to do whatever it takes to compete, even if it means deceiving or lying to your clients, is completely normal. So while they may not practice witchcraft, your normal modern person is a long way from being ideal, because at this level of consciousness, people are blind to the spiritual implications of their actions. So with just a few examples, we can see that what is considered normal changes over time, and as we evolve in consciousness, normal tends to get better. However, today's normal, represented by the modern level of consciousness, is still far from ideal, and for most of us, that's the normal that we're all living in. So, getting back to the medical model, what if helping you heal from bipolar disorder meant not bringing you back to normal, but helping you evolve into a better normal? Taking a traditional-minded person and helping them shift into modern consciousness, helping a modern person work through the issues that hold them back from postmodern thinking, or supporting the postmodern person as they open up to the power of now level. And in this way, the healing of the mental disorder goes hand in hand with accelerating the personal evolution of consciousness of the person in crisis, except that now we don't need to look at this as a crisis at all, but more as a unique opportunity, not only for your soul to heal, but to also evolve. Getting more specific, each of these different levels of consciousness represents a certain way of seeing yourself and seeing your world, and in a sense this is what makes up your ego. To heal from the mental disorder, the person needs to let go of the old, outdated, limited ego and open up to what is for them the complete unknown. And this is what we mean by the ego death, letting the old ways die so that the new ways may take hold. Now this ego death is no small thing. It literally feels like you are choosing to die. And that's what's so hard, because in order to evolve from your current state, the step forward will most likely feel like a confrontation with death. Now there is one other part to being normal which working through your bipolar process can help a lot. And that is because all normal people are emotionally repressed and or traumatized, and these negative experiences are affecting the quality of their lives on a daily basis. So whether you were abused when you were young, or maybe your dad just pushed you too hard, to be normal means carrying some degree of emotional pain with us every day. And in the same way that working through an acute psychosis can open up your ego, this mysterious process can also help you release a great deal of your own personal trauma and emotional repressions very quickly. However, in order to release these experiences, they need to be relived in the moment, so just like confronting your ego death, releasing trauma can be a very difficult process requiring lots of support. So by now I hope you've seen that healing bipolar disorder does not mean bringing you back to normal as modern medicine would have us believe. Nope, it means bringing you back better than normal, or at least better than the normal you were before. It means releasing trauma and emotional repressions and opening up your ego so that you'll feel more comfortable with yourself and your place in the world. And looked at from this perspective, we don't necessarily have to treat your acute psychosis as a disaster, but more as an opportunity for healing, not from your mental disorder, but healing from your so-called normal life. Now there is one thing that I still need to explain. You see, while in a perfect world, trying to work through episodes is the best way to try and heal the disorder, right now in 2011, there just aren't that many people or clinics around to help you do this. So in a way, I feel like I'm encouraging you to fly, except that we don't have any airports. That's the problem. But with that said, there's still lots of reason for hope. Especially in Europe, the Soteria House movement is getting stronger, and a few small clinics are already open to help people work through their initial episodes of psychosis. And in North Carolina, the Fires Creek Center has recently opened. They are the first clinic in the world with the intention of helping people work through experiences of spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis. Even places like São Paulo's Hospitais das Clínicas, the largest hospital in South America, are taking a closer look at the relationship between mental health and spirituality. This year, my wife and I will be participating in weekly meetings with a small number of psychiatrists and psychologists at Hospitais das Clínicas to discuss this topic. And on my social network, Wake the Planet, we already have some people who have slowly worked their way off medications and in the process discovered a number of techniques to help them do so. Now, everyone has taken a different path, but using a variety of approaches, they've found a more gradual way to heal themselves without having to enter into acute psychosis. And it's those techniques that I'll be talking about in my next video. So that's up next. I'd just like to take a moment to thank the members of my social network, Wake the Planet, whose donations and energy have helped make this video possible. And for details on how to join, please see my website at bipolarwakingup.com.